Chapter 1. The Curse Revealed. The moonlight cut through the towering windows of the grand hall, spilling over the silver banners like the cold edge of a blade. The air inside was thick smoke from the ceremonial torches, the musk of too many wolves crammed together, and something else. Expectation. The kind that crawled under your skin and made you sweat, even if you weren't the one standing in the center of it all. Darian stood there anyway, tall and stiff as a blade jammed into the ground. The weight of too many eyes was heavy on him, as if every face in the room could push him into the stone floor, if they stared long enough. He wasn't a stranger to pressure, not by a long shot. But tonight, it wasn't just the weight of their gazes. It was the moon itself, hanging high and full through the windows, watching like it had a stake in the matter. The elders were gathered in a loose half-circle around him, their voices a low, droning hum that scratched at the edges of his mind. They chanted in the old tongue, something he only half understood, something about strength, power, and leadership. All he needed to know was that this was tradition, the kind that didn't ask if you liked it before it swallowed you whole. In the elder's hands was the amulet, a piece of silver shaped like a crescent moon, polished until it shone like a sliver of frost. The thing was older than the pack, older than memory, maybe older than the moon herself. They said it bound the alpha to the goddess. Darian wasn't sure he wanted to be bound to anyone, but he didn't have a choice. Not tonight. Step forward, Darian. Elder Lydia's voice broke through the chant like a crack of thunder. He stepped forward. Not too fast, not too slow, but like a man who didn't mind the weight of 1,000 generations pressing against his shoulders. He kept his face calm, his eyes steady, but he felt the pulse of his own heartbeat in his ears. The amulet was cold when they clasped it around his neck. Silver was supposed to burn wolves, but this didn't. It just lay there, heavy as guilt, and twice as personal. "You are now Alpha of the Silverclaw Pack," Lydia said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "May the moon goddess guide you, and may you guide us in return." The hall erupted into a low, rumbling cheer, the kind that sounded more like a warning than a celebration. Later, after the cheers had died and the torches burned lower, Darian found himself standing by one of the windows, his fingers brushing the silver amulet. The thing felt heavier now, like it had soaked up all the unspoken words in the room. He didn't hear Elder Lydia approach, but he felt her presence, a faint ripple in the air, like the quiet before a storm. She was old, even for a wolf, her silver hair pulled tight into a bun and her eyes sharp enough to slice through steel. "Do you feel it?" she asked, her voice low. Darian didn't turn to look at her. "Feel what?" "The weight," she said. "The curse." He turned then, his eyes narrowing. "You've never been one for subtlety, Lydia." She smirked, a quick thing that vanished almost before it started. "Subtlety is for wolves with time to waste. You don't have any." Darian let out a breath, slow and even. "The blood moon," he said, more to himself than to her. "It rises soon," Lydia said, her voice softer now. "And you know what happens if you haven't chosen a mate by then?" "Ruin," he said, the word bitter on his tongue. "Famine, attacks, the pack's connection to the moon goddess cut off." Lydia nodded, her gaze sharp and steady. "Your father thought he could outsmart it, thought he had time. He was wrong. Don't make the same mistake, Darian." He looked past her, out into the night. The moon was still there, hanging in the sky like a silent judge. Below it, the pack was still gathered, their faces turned upward, glowing pale in the light. They looked hopeful, expectant. His eyes scanned the crowd, catching on the women standing near the edges of the group, young, old, and everything in between. Some looked back at him, their gazes lingering just a little too long. Potential Lunas, each of them waiting to see if he'd choose them. "I won't," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. Lydia's hand rested briefly on his shoulder, a rare gesture of comfort. "The curse has sharp teeth, Darian. Don't let it sink them into your throat." She left him standing there, the weight of her words settling alongside the amulet. He didn't move for a long time, his gaze fixed on the moon, the faces below it, and the shadows that seemed to grow deeper with each passing moment. The moon was a harsh mistress tonight, cold and distant, glaring down at the clearing where the pack had gathered. The silver-claw wolves stood in a tight semicircle, their faces half lit in moonlight, half drenched in shadow. The air was so quiet it felt heavy, every breath laced with the metallic tang of tension. In the center of it all, Darian stood with Alina at his side. She looked steady enough, strong jaw, straight shoulders, and a gaze that could cut a man in two if she wanted. But there was a nervous twitch to her fingers as she clasped her hands in front of her, the way you'd grip a knife if you didn't trust your own aim. The elders loomed just behind them, their eyes as sharp as razors. They'd gone through the motions, the chanting, the incense, the ceremonial words in a language older than the stones beneath their feet. Now it was up to Darian and Alina to finish the ritual, to seal the bond that would make her his Luna and silence the whispers about the blood moon curse. Darian shifted on his feet, his voice steady as he began the vows. The words came easy, they were carved into the back of his mind from years of hearing them, but his chest was tight, his instincts pulling at him like a rope tied around his ribs. Something felt wrong. "I take you as my Luna," he said, his voice carrying through the clearing. "Bound under the moon, tied by the goddess's will." Alina looked at him, her lips trembling just slightly before she spoke. "And I accept you as my alpha," bound under the rest of the words never made it out. It hit her fast, like a bullet through glass. Her eyes went wide, her body arching back, as if someone had driven a knife between her ribs. The air crackled around her, dark and sharp, and then she crumpled to the ground, her body jerking in convulsions. The pack froze. For a second, there was nothing but silence, the kind that slams into you like a punch to the gut. Then someone screamed sharp and raw and the spell broke. Wolves surged forward, a jumble of snarls and panicked voices, but Darian was already on his knees beside her. "Alina," he barked, his hands on her shoulders. She felt too light, too fragile, her skin cold under his fingers. Her eyes fluttered, unfocused, and her lips moved like she was trying to say something, but nothing came out except a faint, broken sound. The healer, an older wolf named Kellen, shoved through the crowd and dropped to his knees beside them. His hands were steady, but his eyes weren't. There was something there, something dark, something he wasn't saying yet. "What's happening to her?" Darian snapped, his voice tight. Kellen didn't answer right away. He pressed 2 fingers to Alina's neck, then her wrist, his brow furrowing deeper with each passing second. Finally he looked up, and the expression on his face hit Darian like a fist to the gut. "She's rejecting the bond," Kellen said, his voice low and grim. "What do you mean rejecting it?" Darian demanded, his voice rising. "That's not supposed to happen." "It's the curse," Kellen said, and the word hung in the air like a noose. "If you force the bond, it'll kill her." The pack went still, the kind of stillness that feels like the edge of a cliff. Darian could feel their eyes on him, sharp and heavy, each one like a knife pressing into his back. The whispers started then, low and scattered, but they carried. The curse. "It's real. What's going to happen to us?" Darian clenched his jaw, his hands tightening on Alina's shoulders. He wanted to argue, to shout, to deny what Kellen had said, but Alina's body was already telling him the truth. Her breaths were shallow, her skin pale, her heart weak. If he pushed this any further, it wouldn't be a bond, it'd be a death sentence. "Get her to the infirmary," he growled, his voice cutting through the noise. 2 wolves stepped forward, lifting Alina's limp body carefully before carrying her away. The crowd parted for them, but no one left. They stayed rooted in place, their whispers growing louder, their fear bleeding into the air like a sickness. Later, after the crowd had dispersed and the clearing was empty, Darian sat in his quarters with the curtains drawn and the amulet around his neck, feeling heavier than ever. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint silver glow of the moon outside. It filtered through the cracks, casting jagged shadows across the walls. He didn't bother lighting a candle. The darkness suited him tonight. His thoughts were a storm, crashing against each other with no room to breathe. The curse. The pack. Alina. The goddess. It all twisted together, a knot he couldn't untangle. He pressed his fingers to the amulet, his jaw tight. He'd been raised to be an alpha. To lead. To protect. But what kind of alpha couldn't even save his own Luna? What kind of alpha let a curse hang over his pack like a sword waiting to drop? A knock broke through the silence. "Not now," he said, his voice low and rough. There was a pause, then the sound of retreating footsteps. He didn't need to guess who it was. The pack wanted answers, but tonight he didn't have any. He let out a slow breath, his hand falling from the amulet. One thing was clear. The curse wasn't going to go away on its own. If he didn't find a way to break it, it wouldn't just destroy him, it would destroy them all. The moonlight shifted, and for a moment he thought he saw a shadow move across the room. A trick of the light, he told himself. But as he stared at the silver glow on the floor, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. Something dark. The elders' quarters were perched on the farthest edge of the Silverclaw territory. A dark, crooked cabin that sat hunched like it wanted to collapse under its own secrets. The moonlight caught on the frost-rimed roof as Darian pushed open the heavy door. Inside, it smelled of old wood and something sharper, herbs, maybe, or dried blood. Elder Lydia was sitting by the hearth, her back straight despite her years. Her hair was silver-white and pulled tight against her skull, and her eyes were like twin knives glinting under a layer of ash. She didn't look up when Darian entered, but she didn't need to. "You're late," she said, her voice scraping like gravel underfoot. "I didn't know I was on a schedule," Darian shot back, pulling the door closed behind him. He stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his boots. Lydia finally looked up, her eyes narrowing as they fixed on him. "You should have come sooner," she said, "but I suppose stubbornness runs in your blood." Darian ignored the dig and dropped into the chair across from her. The firelight flickered between them, casting shadows on the walls that danced like restless wolves. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and fixed her with a look that he hoped was steady, even if he didn't feel it. "Tell me what you know about the curse," he said. Lydia's lips twitched, but it wasn't a smile. "Straight to the point, then. That's one thing I do like about you, Darian." She reached for a small bundle of herbs on the table beside her and began to crush them between her fingers. The scent was sharp and earthy, filling the room like a warning. "The blood moon curse isn't just a story to keep pups in line," she said. "It's real. Your father thought he could outrun it, thought he could cheat it, but it caught him just the same. It always does." Darian's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Lydia didn't talk much, and when she did, it was like prying words out of stone. Best not to waste time with arguments. "It started centuries ago," she went on, her voice slow and deliberate, like she was piecing the story together as she told it. "A Luna named Solara, betrayed by her mate the alpha she trusted. He cast her aside for another, and in her grief, she turned to the moon goddess for vengeance. She got it too. She cursed the alpha, his bloodline, and every alpha who followed. No Luna could save them unless they proved their love was stronger than ambition, stronger than power." Her fingers stilled, the crushed herbs lying in a pile on the table. "That's the story, anyway. But there's more." Darian frowned. "More?" Solara's spirit didn't just curse the bloodline. She left something behind, something dark, something alive. The shadow wolf. It clings to every alpha it finds, feeding on their doubts, their fears, their failures. "You've felt it, haven't you?" Darian's stomach tightened, but he didn't let it show. "What I've felt isn't important," he said. "What I need is a solution." Lydia chuckled, low and dry. "Always so practical," she said. "But solutions don't come cheap and they don't come easy. There's one thing, though. A rogue, a wolf who doesn't belong to any pack. An Omega named Saren. An Omega? Darian's voice hardened. What could an Omega possibly do about this? Not just any Omega, Lydia said. She's not bound by the packs, by the politics, by the bloodlines. They say she's tied to the moon goddess, that she carries a piece of Solara's magic. If anyone can break the curse, it might be her. But finding her won't be easy. She's been running from wolves her whole life. Darian leaned back in his chair, his mind working fast. Saren. The name sounded sharp, like a blade. A rogue Omega with ties to the moon goddess? It didn't sit right, but then again, nothing had felt right since the night of his ascension. Where is she? He asked. Lydia shook her head. If I knew that, I'd have told you already. But I've heard rumors. She moves through the forests on the outskirts of our territory, always staying just out of reach. She's a ghost, Darian, but you're an alpha. If anyone can track her, it's you. Darian stood, the chair scraping against the floor as he pushed it back. Then I'll find her, he said. Lydia's gaze followed him to the door. Be careful, she said. The curse isn't just a story, and Saren isn't just a wolf. If you go looking for her, you might not like what you find. Darian paused, his hand on the doorframe. I'll take my chances, he said. The night air hit him like a slap as he stepped outside, cold and sharp. The moon was still high, still watching, and he felt its gaze like a weight on his shoulders. He didn't look back at Lydia's cabin. He didn't need to. He had his answer, or at least part of it. Saren was out there, somewhere, and she was his last shot. He didn't know what he'd find when he caught her, but one thing was clear. The blood moon wasn't going to wait, and neither could he. Chapter 2. The forest had a way of swallowing sound. No birds called, no leaves rustled. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath when it passed through the trees. It was the kind of quiet that made most wolves nervous, but Saren had made her peace with it long ago. Her cabin sat in the middle of the clearing, leaning slightly to one side like it might decide to collapse one of these days. The walls were patched with old planks and mud, but it held up against the rain, and the roof didn't leak too much. Inside, it smelled of dried herbs, wood smoke, and a faint edge of animal musk, her own scent, faint enough to go unnoticed by anyone who didn't know what to look for. She knelt by the hearth, stirring a pot that bubbled thick and slow over the fire. The smell of the stew filled the room, rich and earthy, but Saren didn't seem to notice. Her mind was somewhere else, someplace darker and colder. She'd spent years making sure no one could find her out here, far from any pack's territory. She'd scattered charms around the perimeter of the clearing, twisted things made of bone and twine, and the kind of symbols that made even the bravest wolves hesitate. They weren't magic, not really, but they did their job. Wolves didn't come near her unless they were desperate, and desperation was a dangerous thing. The cabin was cluttered with the life she'd built for herself, tools she'd made, furs she'd tanned, herbs she'd picked and dried. A set of hunting knives hung by the door, gleaming faintly in the dim light. Pelts were stacked in one corner, neatly folded, ready to be traded if she ever felt like venturing to the fringes of a human village. The walls were lined with charms she'd crafted from feathers, bone and stone, tied together with bits of leather and string. Some were practical talismans for good hunting, charms to keep sickness at bay. Others were there to ward off memories she didn't want, memories of the life she'd left behind. She didn't miss it. That's what she told herself every day. Every time she glanced at the moon through the trees and felt a flicker of something she couldn't name, she buried it deep and told herself she didn't miss it. The pack she'd grown up in, the wolves who'd betrayed her, the rules and rituals and endless politics, it was all behind her now. Saren had made her choice, and she wasn't going back. Not for anything. Still, the dreams came. Last night it had been the same as always. The moon hanging heavy and low, closer than it had any right to be. She'd been standing in a forest, but it wasn't the forest she knew. The trees were blackened, burned, their branches stretching like claws toward the sky, and in the clearing, bathed in silver light, there she was, the Moon Queen. Saren had never seen her face, not fully. It was always hidden, half in shadow, half in light. But her voice was sharp as glass, slicing through the quiet. "Run all you like," she'd said, her tone neither cruel nor kind. "You can't escape what you are." Then she'd woken up, her chest tight and her hands clenched in the blankets like they'd been trying to strangle the dream out of her. She told herself it didn't mean anything. Dreams were just dreams, nothing more. Saren ladled the stew into a chipped wooden bowl and sat at the rickety table near the window. The sky outside was turning dark, the first stars blinking through the canopy. She ate slowly, staring out at the trees, her knife within easy reach on the table. Her thoughts drifted, unbidden, to the Silverclaw pack. She'd heard the rumors even out here how the Blood Moon curse had caught up to them again, how the new alpha would have to prove himself or lose everything. She snorted into her stew. Packs were all the same, clinging to their traditions like drowning wolves clung to driftwood. The Silverclaw pack was no different, no matter how much power they thought they had. Still, a flicker of curiosity crept into her mind, unwelcome and uninvited. What kind of alpha had they saddled themselves with this time? Another one who thought power came from the size of his claws, no doubt. She pushed the thought away. It wasn't her problem. She had enough to deal with without getting tangled in someone else's mess. The fire in the hearth crackled, the shadows on the walls dancing in jagged shapes. Saren leaned back in her chair, the wooden legs creaking under her weight. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her. The moon goddess's voice echoed in her mind, soft and sharp at once. "You can't escape what you are." Saren opened her eyes and stared at the fire. Her jaw tightened, her fingers curling into fists. "I already did," she muttered to no one but herself. Outside, the wind shifted, rustling the leaves in the trees. For a moment, it sounded like something moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. Saren's eyes flicked to the door, her body tensing. She reached for the knife, her fingers wrapping around the hilt. But the sound faded, and the clearing went quiet again. Saren didn't relax. She never did. The forest didn't give up its secrets easily, but Darien was good at pushing where it hurt. The trees here were thick and gnarled, their branches clawing at the sky like they were trying to tear it down. The ground was soft underfoot, the kind that didn't carry a sound if you knew how to walk. Darien's warriors flanked him, moving like shadows through the underbrush. None of them spoke, and he didn't need to tell them to stay sharp. They all felt it, the tension in the air, the faint prickle at the back of the neck that told you someone was watching. "She's close," one of them muttered, his voice low enough to barely carry. Darien didn't respond. He could smell it too, wolf and smoke, faint but there, carried on the wind. He didn't know much about Saren, but he knew enough. Rogue Omega, stubborn as hell. If she thought they'd scare her into helping, she was in for a surprise. The cabin came into view like a secret whispered in the dark. It sat crooked in a small clearing, leaning against itself like it was trying to hide. Smoke curled from the chimney, faint and gray, and the charms strung up around the perimeter caught the moonlight like teeth. Darien's lips twitched into something that might been a smirk if it didn't feel so bitter. Charms wouldn't keep him out. He stepped into the clearing without slowing, his warriors holding back at the edge of the trees. The moment his boot hit the open ground, the door to the cabin creaked open, and Saren stepped out. She wasn't what he'd expected. The stories painted her as some wild thing, all sharp teeth and bristling fur. What he saw instead was a woman, lean and tense, with a knife in her hand and a glint in her eyes that said she was thinking about using it. Her hair was dark, tied back out of her face, and her clothes were practical leather, wool, and not an inch of excess. She didn't look like a rogue. She looked like a survivor. "You lost, Alpha?" she called, her voice cutting through the clearing like a blade. Darien stopped a few feet from the cabin, planting his feet like he was staking a claim. "I found what I was looking for," he said, his voice calm, even. Her eyes flicked to the warriors lurking in the trees. "Brought back up, I see. Afraid little old me's gonna bite?" "Just being careful," he said. "You're not exactly known for your hospitality." She snorted, leaning against the doorframe. The knife in her hand caught the moonlight, and her grip on it was casual, but not careless. If you were being careful, you wouldn't have come here at all. Darian took another step forward, ignoring the way her eyes narrowed. I need your help, he said. That got a laugh out of her. It wasn't a kind laugh, it was sharp and hollow, the kind that made a man feel like he'd just stepped on thin ice. Of course you do, she said, straightening. Let me guess. Some big, bad curse is breathing down your neck, and the elders told you the scary rogue in the woods might be your salvation. Is that about right? Right? Close enough, he said, his jaw tightening. She raised an eyebrow. And what makes you think I'd care? I'm not part of your pack, Alpha. Your problems aren't mine. This isn't just my problem, Darian said, taking another step forward. It's the pack's problem. The blood moon curse isn't a story. It's real, and if I don't fix it, everyone suffers. Everyone? She asked, tilting her head like she was humoring him. Or just you? Darian felt the tension coil in his chest, but he didn't let it show. The curse doesn't care who you are. It'll burn through the pack until there's nothing left. You might not want to be a part of this, but that doesn't mean you aren't. Saren's gaze hardened, and for a moment, the casual edge in her voice disappeared. You think I owe you something? She said, her tone low and sharp. You think just because you showed up here, I'm going to throw myself into your mess? It's not about owing me, Darian snapped, his voice rising. It's about doing the right thing. The right thing. She stepped away from the door, her movements quick and deliberate. The right thing would have been your pack leaving me alone in the first place. The right thing would have been not dragging me into your politics, your rules, your traditions. I've seen what the right thing looks like in a pack. It's a knife in the back and blood on the floor. Her words hit harder than they should have, but Darian didn't flinch. He met her glare head on, his own frustration bubbling to the surface. I didn't come here to argue, he said. I came here because you're my last chance. If you don't help me, my pack is finished. You might not care about us, but I care about them. So, tell me what's it going to take to get you to listen? For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind brushing through the trees. Saren's grip on the knife tightened, and her eyes searched his faceless like she was trying to find a crack in the armor. Finally, she let out a breath, shaking her head. You want to break the curse, she said, her voice quiet but sharp. Fine. I'll tell you what I think. I think the curse is a fairy tale for weak alphas who can't handle their own shadows. You want help. You're looking in the wrong place. Darian's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't move. He stared at her, the fire in his chest barely held in check. You're wrong, he said, his voice low. And I'll prove it. She didn't answer, just turned and walked back into the cabin, slamming the door behind her. Darian stood there for a long moment, the cold wind cutting through his clothes like a blade. Finally, he turned and strode back to the tree line, his warriors falling into step beside him. She's not going to help us, one of them said. She will, Darian said, his voice hard. She just doesn't know it yet. The wind shifted first. It slithered into the clearing like it had something to say, but couldn't decide how to say it. Saren caught it right away. She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes narrowing as she tilted her head slightly, listening. Darian didn't miss the change. He'd been arguing with her for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. But the moment she froze, so did he. What is it? He asked, his voice low. She raised a hand, signaling for silence, her gaze cutting through the shadows at the edge of the clearing. The wind carried a new scent now, faint but unmistakable. Wolves. Rogues, she said. The word clipped and bitter. Darian's hand went to the hilt of the blade at his side before he could think about it. His warriors were too far back, waiting in the trees where he'd left them. He didn't have time to call for them now. How many? He asked. Saren's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, enough to make this interesting. The first rogue broke through the tree line a heartbeat later, a hulking mass of fur and teeth moving fast and low. Saren didn't flinch. She moved before Darian could blink, pulling a second knife from her belt and throwing it in one fluid motion. The knife caught the rogue in the shoulder, spinning him sideways with a yelp of pain. He hit the ground hard, but he wasn't alone. 2 more rogues followed, snarling as they barreled into the clearing. "Stay behind me," Darian barked, stepping forward. Saren laughed, sharp and humorless. "Not a chance, Alpha." She darted past him, her movements quick and deliberate, a blur of leather and steel. The second rogue lunged at her, claws swiping through the air, but she sidestepped easily, her knife slashing across his flank as she moved. Darian didn't have time to watch. The third rogue came straight for him, teeth bared and eyes wild. Darian drew his blade in a smooth motion, the silver edge catching the moonlight as he met the attack head-on. The clash was brutal and fast, all muscle and instinct. The rogue snarled, snapping at Darian's throat, but he twisted out of the way, slamming the hilt of his blade into the wolf's ribs. The rogue staggered, but it didn't slow down. They never did. Across the clearing, Saren was holding her own. She moved like she was born to fight, all sharp edges and precision. Her knives flashed in the moonlight, each strike calculated to wound, to slow, to disable. Darian caught a glimpse of her out of the corner of his eye and felt a flicker of something he couldn't name. Respect, maybe, or something close to it. The rogue in front of him lunged again, and Darian drove his blade into its side, twisting hard. The wolf let out a strangled growl before collapsing, its body hitting the ground with a dull thud. He turned just in time to see Saren finish off the last rogue, her knife buried to the hilt in its chest. She pulled it free with a sharp motion, stepping back as the wolf crumpled at her feet. The clearing went still again, the only sound the ragged breathing of the 2 wolves left standing. Darian straightened, wiping his blade on the grass before sheathing it. Saren didn't move right away. She stood over the dead rogue, her shoulders rising and falling with each breath. Her grip on the white knife. "You fight well," he said, breaking the silence. She turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "So do you," she said after a moment. He didn't miss the note of surprise in her voice, faint but there. "Are you hurt?" he asked, taking a step closer. "No," she said, sliding the knife back into her belt. "And don't pretend you care." Darian ignored the jab, his gaze scanning the clearing. "Rogues don't attack like this without a reason," he said. "They were coming for you." Saren shrugged, her tone flat. "They always do." "Why?" She didn't answer, turning away to retrieve the knife she'd thrown earlier. Darian didn't press her. Not yet. Instead, he watched as she wiped the blade clean and slipped it into its sheath, her movements quick and practiced. "They'll be back," he said finally. "Probably," she said, not looking at him. "You can't stay here," he said, his voice firm. She turned then, her eyes sharp and cold. "And what do you suggest, Alpha? That I follow you back to your pack like some lost pup?" "No thanks." "It's not about what you want," he said, stepping closer. "You're in danger here, and whether you like it or not, you're involved in this now." She laughed, low and bitter. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't your fight. It's mine. It's always been mine." "Not anymore," he said, his tone steady. "If we're going to stop this, we need to work together. You can't do it alone." For a moment, she didn't respond. She just stared at him, her jaw tight, her eyes flashing with something that might been anger or might been fear. Finally, she let out a sharp breath and shook her head. "Fine," she said, her voice low. "But don't expect me to save your pack, Alpha. I'm not a miracle worker." "I'm not asking for a miracle," he said. "Just a chance." She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked toward the cabin, her shoulders stiff, her steps deliberate. Darian watched her go, his jaw clenched. This wasn't how he'd wanted it to go, but it was a start. As the wind shifted again, carrying the scent of blood and smoke into the night, he felt the weight of the curse settle heavier on his shoulders. It wasn't just about him anymore. It never had been. Chapter 3. The Silverclaw Pack's territory stretched wide and proud, a patchwork of dense forests, rolling hills, and jagged cliffs that broke against the horizon like the edge of a shattered mirror. Normally, Darien felt a quiet satisfaction when he crossed back into it, an alpha surveying his kingdom. Not tonight. Tonight, the air was too sharp, too heavy. Saren walked beside him, her face set like stone. She hadn't said much since they left the forest, but she didn't need to. The silence between them was a live thing, twisting and snarling like a trapped animal. Behind them, Darien's warriors followed at a safe distance, their eyes flicking between Saren and their alpha, like they were waiting for something to explode. By the time they reached the pack's main settlement, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Wolves were already gathering, stepping out of cabins and from behind trees, their eyes narrowing as they took in the unfamiliar figure at Darien's side. "She's an Omega," someone whispered, loud enough for it to carry. "What's she doing here?" Another voice muttered, sharp and accusing. Darien's jaw tightened, but he didn't stop walking. He could feel the weight of their stares pressing into his back, could hear the whispers chasing after him like hounds. It was the same tone they always used when something didn't fit neatly into their world. Fear dressed up as suspicion, wrapped in a thin layer of self-righteousness. Saren didn't so much as glance at them. If the muttering bothered her, she didn't show it. Her steps were steady, her gaze fixed straight ahead, but Darien caught the faintest tension in her shoulders. She wasn't unaffected, just good at hiding it. By the time they reached the grand hall, the elders were already waiting. They stood in a loose semicircle near the main doors, their expressions a mix of disbelief and disapproval. "Darien," Elder Lydia said, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "What is the meaning of this?" He stopped a few paces away from them, his hands at his sides, loose but ready. Saren stopped too, a step behind him, her arms crossed and her head tilted just slightly, like she was already preparing for a fight. "This is Saren," Darien said, his tone steady. "She's going to help us break the curse." The silence that followed was sharp enough to hurt. Lydia's gaze flicked to Saren, her lips pressing into a thin line. The other elders weren't as subtle. "An Omega," one of them said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You brought an outsider into our pack, a rogue, no less, and you expect us to believe she can help?" "I expect you to trust me," Darien shot back, his voice low and firm. "I'm the Alpha. It's my decision." "You're the Alpha," Lydia said, her tone cool, "but you're also young. This curse has outlasted stronger wolves than you, Darien. You can't fix it by dragging some stranger into our fold and hoping for a miracle." "She's not just some stranger," Darien said, his voice rising. "She's tied to the moon goddess. She has powers that none of us can understand. If anyone can help us, it's her." "She's an Omega," another elder said, spitting the word like it was poison. "She has no place here." Darien turned sharply to face them, his fists clenching at his sides. "She has a place because I gave her one," he said, his voice hard. "I didn't bring her here for you to like her. I brought her here because this curse will destroy us if we don't stop it. If you have a better idea, now's the time to say it." The elders exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them spoke. Darien's gaze swept over them, daring them to challenge him, but they looked away one by one. Lydia's eyes lingered on Saren, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded, once. "You've made your choice," she said. "I just hope it's the right one." The crowd outside hadn't dispersed. As Darien and Saren stepped back into the open air, the whispers picked up again, louder this time, bolder. "She doesn't belong here. This is a mistake. The curse is already getting to him." Darien stopped in his tracks, turning to face them. The crowd froze, their eyes wide as they realized they had his full attention. "She's here because I need her," he said, his voice carrying through the clearing like a growl. "You don't have to like it, but you will respect it. Do I make myself clear?" No one answered, but the whispers stopped. Darien turned back to Saren, his jaw tight. "Let's go," he said. She followed him without a word, but as they walked, He caught the faintest flicker of something in her expression. Amusement. "You've got a way with words, Alpha," she said, her tone dry. "You've got a way of making things harder than they need to be," he shot back. Her smile widened, just slightly. "You'll get used to it." He didn't answer. He wasn't sure he wanted to. The grand hall wasn't grand enough to hold Siren's disdain. She stood in the center of the room, arms crossed, her expression teetering between a smirk and a scowl. Around her, the elders fidgeted, their silence brimming with barely contained irritation. Darian stood near the far wall, his jaw tight, his hands resting on his hips like he was trying to keep himself from throwing something. "You're not serious," Siren said, her tone light but laced with venom. Darian stepped forward, the tension in his shoulders making every movement deliberate. "This isn't a joke, Siren," he said, his voice measured but firm. "Funny," she said, tilting her head, "because it feels like one." The room bristled. One of the elders muttered something under his breath, but Darian silenced him with a sharp glance. His focus was locked on Siren now, his patience thinning by the second. "We brought you here to help," he said, his tone edging toward anger. "You knew what that meant." "No," Siren shot back, her voice rising just enough to cut through his. "You brought me here to be your scapegoat. Let's not pretend this is about me helping, it's about you needing someone to blame when this all goes to hell." Darian's lips thinned, but he held his ground. "You're tied to the moon goddess," he said, his voice low but charged. "If anyone can break this curse, it's you, but that means you need to." "To what?" Siren interrupted, stepping closer. "Oh, my head. Say a few pretty words to make your elders feel better. Pretend I care about your little rituals." Her words hit like a slap, and the room seemed to shrink around them. The elders shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. Siren's gaze flicked to them, her smirk sharpening. "Let's get one thing straight," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "I don't owe you anything. Not your pack, not your traditions, and definitely not your curses." Darian's temper snapped. He closed the distance between them in 2 quick strides, his presence looming over her like a storm about to break. "You think this is about traditions?" he said, his voice a low growl. "This is about survival. If we don't break this curse, the pack will fall apart. Wolves will die. Do you even care about that?" Her eyes flared, but she didn't back down. "Care about what?" "A pack that looks at me like I'm dirt under their paws. A pack that only sees me as a tool, not a wolf." She laughed, bitter and sharp. "Yeah, sure, let me pour my heart out for that." Darian's fists clenched at his sides. "You're impossible." "And you're predictable," she snapped back. The big bad alpha, desperate to save his pack. So he drags the rogue into his mess and expects her to play nice. Well, newsflash, Alpha, I don't play nice. The tension between them was a live thing now, thick and suffocating. For a moment, neither of them moved, the air crackling like it was waiting for one of them to break. Then Siren's gaze flicked to Darian's face, and she froze. There was something there, something dark and wild just beneath the surface. His eyes seemed to flicker, a faint glow that wasn't natural. Around him, the shadows seemed to stretch, twisting in ways they shouldn't. "What?" Siren started, her voice faltering for the first time. Darian's eyes narrowed. "What?" She took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run. "There's something wrong with you," she said, her voice quieter now, edged with unease. Darian frowned, his temper momentarily forgotten. "What are you talking about?" Siren didn't answer right away. She was too busy staring at the faint, dark aura that clung to him like smoke. It wasn't visible, not to anyone who didn't know what to look for. But she saw it, and it sent a chill down her spine. She shook her head, snapping herself out of it. "Never mind," she muttered, turning away. "Forget it." Darian grabbed her arm, not hard, but enough to stop her. "What did you see?" he demanded. "Nothing," she said, yanking her arm free. "Just nothing." For a moment they stood there, the tension between them shifting into something heavier, something harder to name. Darian's gaze searched her face, but she didn't give anything away. Finally, he let out a slow breath and stepped back. "This isn't going to work if you don't cooperate," he said, his voice quieter now, though no less firm. Saren crossed her arms, her gaze hard. "Then maybe it's not going to work." Darian stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then he turned and walked toward the door, his steps heavy. "You can stay here and sulk," he said over his shoulder. "Or you can prove you're more than just a rogue with a chip on her shoulder. Your choice." He didn't wait for her reply. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Saren alone in the room with the echoes of their argument and the lingering unease of what she'd seen. She glanced at the shadows on the walls, her chest tightening. Whatever that thing was clinging to him, it wasn't just the curse. It was something darker. "Great," she muttered to herself, running a hand through her hair. "Just what I needed. A cursed alpha with a temper and a shadow problem." But even as she said it, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't something she could walk away from, not anymore. The archives didn't look like much from the outside. Just another low, squat building tucked between the grand hall and the elders' quarters, its roof sagging under the weight of time and neglect. But Saren wasn't fooled. Places like this always held more than they let on. The night had settled in thick and heavy, shadows pooling like ink across the Silverclaw territory. Saren slipped through them like a ghost, her footsteps silent against the packed dirt. She didn't bother looking over her shoulder. Wolves like these were loud when they thought they were sneaky. She reached the door without incident, her fingers brushing over the latch. Locked. Of course. She smirked to herself, pulling a thin blade from her boot. Locks were for people who believed rules were unbreakable. Saren wasn't one of those people. The lock gave with a soft click, and she eased the door open, slipping inside and closing it behind her. The room smelled like dust and old wood, the kind of smell that clung to forgotten things. Shelves lined the walls, packed tight with leather-bound books and brittle scrolls. A single lantern burned low in the corner, casting just enough light to keep the dark at bay. Saren moved quickly, her eyes scanning the shelves. The elders had talked about the curse in vague, dramatic terms, but she wasn't interested in stories. She wanted the truth, the ugly, unvarnished truth. Her fingers brushed over the spines of books, the edges of scrolls, searching for something that felt wrong. She didn't know how to explain it, but she'd always had a knack for finding the things people didn't want her to see. It didn't take long. Tucked in the back corner of the room, half hidden behind a stack of crumbling tomes, was a scroll that didn't match the rest. The leather casing was cracked and faded, the ties loose as if it had been opened and shut too many times. She pulled it free, her hands steady despite the faint tremor of anticipation running through her. The scroll was heavy in her hands, the weight of it promising secrets that weren't meant to be shared. Saren unrolled it carefully, her eyes narrowing as she made out the faded script. The writing was old, the kind that felt ancient even before you knew what it said. It didn't take long for the story to unfold. Solara. That was the name the elders had mentioned, the Luna who'd cursed the Silverclaw bloodline. The scroll told her story in stark, painful detail. A Luna betrayed by her mate, cast aside for another, her love discarded like it meant nothing. Saren's grip on the scroll tightened as she read. Solara's heartbreak was like a wound that bled across the words, her anger sharp enough to taste. She'd turned to the moon goddess for vengeance, and the goddess had answered. The curse wasn't just a punishment, it was a scar, carved into the bloodline like a brand. Every alpha would carry it, their strength undermined by doubt, their packs weakened by division, until one of them proved their love was stronger than ambition, stronger than power, stronger than fear. Saren leaned back, her breath slow and measured. There was more, she knew, but the scroll's ending was torn, the last few lines missing. Whatever solution it hinted at was lost, leaving only fragments of a truth that felt just out of reach. Of course, she muttered, rolling the scroll back up. Nothing was ever simple. She stayed crouched by the shelves for a moment, her mind turning over the pieces. True love and selfless sacrifice, it sounded like something out of a bad story, The kind of thing wolves whispered to themselves when they didn't want to face reality. But there was a weight to it, something that made her stomach twist. She should tell Darian. That was the obvious choice, wasn't it? Hand him the scroll, let him figure it out, and walk away. Except she didn't trust him. Not yet. And something about Solara's story, about the curse, felt personal in a way she couldn't explain. No, she'd keep this to herself for now. The sound of footsteps outside snapped her out of her thoughts. Saren moved fast, sliding the scroll into her jacket and melting into the shadows at the edge of the room. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside, a young warrior, his eyes scanning the room nervously. He didn't see her, his focus on the shelves. Probably sent to check on the archives after someone noticed the lock was picked. Saren slipped out behind him, silent as a breath. The night air hit her like a slap, sharp and cold, but she didn't stop. By the time she reached the edge of the settlement, her heart had settled, her steps light and deliberate. She didn't look back. Whatever answers the scroll held, they weren't ready to be shared. Not yet. But as she glanced at the moon through the trees, she felt the faintest flicker of something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Hope. The forest stretched out like a maze of shadows, the trees close and gnarled, their branches clawing at the sky. The patrol moved in practiced silence, the rhythm of boots crunching against leaves broken only by the occasional rustle of a bird startled into flight. Darian was at the head of the group, his shoulders tense, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. The weight of the curse sat heavy on him, like a hand pressing against the back of his neck. He'd been feeling it more and more lately, the pressure, the anger, the other thing. The thing he didn't have a name for. Behind him, the pack's beta Ronan cleared his throat. "Something's wrong," he muttered, his voice low enough to blend with the wind. "You feel it too?" Darian asked, not bothering to look back. Ronan nodded, his hand brushing the hilt of his knife. "Feels like we're being watched." Darian didn't answer. He didn't trust his voice. His skin felt too tight, his senses too sharp. The air smelled wrong, metallic like blood, but faint enough to make him question whether it was real or just his imagination. The group pressed on, the tension between them like a live wire. Saren trailed at the back, her steps light but deliberate. She hadn't said much since they set out, her gaze flicking between the trees and Darian like she was weighing something in her mind. She was good at staying quiet, Darian had to give her that. Too good. They reached a clearing, the moonlight spilling over the ground in jagged patches. Darian stopped, holding up a hand. The others froze, their eyes snapping to him. "Spread out," he said, his voice steady. The wolves moved without hesitation, fanning out around the clearing. Darian stayed where he was, his breath slow and deliberate, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. Then it hit him. It started as a flicker of heat at the base of his spine, spreading fast and sharp, like fire running through his veins. His vision blurred, the edges of the world going dark, and for a moment he thought he was falling. "Darian?" Ronan's voice cut through the haze, sharp and uncertain. He turned toward it, but the movement was wrong, too fast, too jerky. The world tilted, and when it righted itself, Ronan was standing too close, his expression a mix of confusion and fear. "What's wrong with you?" Ronan asked, his hand tightening on his weapon. "I don't," Darian started, but his voice wasn't his. It was deeper, rougher, like it was crawling out of some dark pit inside him. He took a step forward, and the clearing shifted. The wolves around him moved back instinctively, their eyes wide, their bodies tense. "Alpha," Ronan said, his voice low and cautious, "you're not yourself." Darian felt it then, the thing that had been lurking in the back of his mind, the thing he'd been ignoring for too long. It wasn't just anger. It was something darker, something alive. His hands clenched into fists, his nails lengthening into claws. He could feel his wolf form pushing to the surface, but it wasn't natural. It wasn't him. The shadows around him deepened, twisting and curling like smoke. His vision went red, and the growl that tore from his throat wasn't one he recognized. Ronan took a step back, his hand on his blade. "Darien, stop," he said, his voice shaking. But Darien didn't stop. He lunged. The chaos that followed was fast and brutal. Ronan barely dodged the attack, rolling to the side as Darien's claws tore through the air where he'd been standing. The other wolves shouted, their voices a tangle of fear and confusion, but none of them dared get too close. Darien was a blur of motion, his strikes wild but devastating. He couldn't stop himself, couldn't think past the haze of rage and the overwhelming need to destroy. And then she stepped in. "Darien." Saren's voice cut through the clearing like a blade, sharp and commanding. He turned toward her, his vision narrowing, the dark thing inside him surging forward. She didn't flinch. Her hands moved quickly, pulling something from her belt, a small charm made of bone and leather. She held it up, her voice steady as she began to chant in a language Darien didn't understand. The words were soft at first, barely audible over the sound of his growls, but they grew louder, stronger, until they seemed to fill the clearing. The shadows around him twisted violently, like they were fighting her, but she didn't stop. Her voice was unwavering, her eyes locked on his. Darien felt the heat in his veins start to fade, the fire dimming to embers. His vision cleared, the red tint fading as the shadows around him dissipated. When he came back to himself, he was on his knees, his breath ragged, his hands trembling. Saren stood a few feet away, her expression unreadable, the charm still clutched in her hand. The rest of the pack stared at her, their faces a mix of shock and something else, something that looked a lot like fear. "What did you do?" Ronan asked, his voice low and wary. "I stopped him," Saren said simply, tucking the charm back into her belt. Ronan didn't look convinced. "How?" She didn't answer, her gaze shifting to Darien. He met her eyes, his throat dry. "What was that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "That," she said, was the shadow wolf. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, but before he could respond, she stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You can't fight this on your own," she said, her tone serious. "Whatever this curse is, it's not just some story. It's alive, and it's going to consume you if you let it." Darien swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. "And breaking it," she continued, her voice softer now. "That's going to take more than strength. It's going to take facing the moon goddess herself." He stared at her, his chest tight, his mind reeling. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to process what had just happened. But one thing was clear. He needed Saren. Chapter 4. The mornings were the worst. The sunlight hit like an interrogation lamp, peeling back every shadow and leaving nothing to hide behind. Darien stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror of his quarters, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw set like it might hold back whatever was crawling up from his chest. The shadow wolf wasn't content to stay in the dark anymore. It crept into the edges of his mind, slipping through cracks he hadn't known were there. It whispered when he was alone, a low growl that sounded too much like his own voice. "You're losing it," it would say. "They see it. They know. And maybe it wasn't wrong." There were bruises on his knuckles from the night before, though he couldn't remember what he'd hit. His muscles ached, his skin felt too tight, and the lingering scent of blood in the air told him he'd done something he'd regret. A knock at the door jolted him back to the present. It wasn't timid, but it wasn't demanding either. Just steady, rhythmic. "Come in," he said, his voice rough. The healer, Kellen, stepped in, his expression as grim as ever. The older wolf had a way of looking at you that made you feel like he already knew everything you were going to say, and none of it was good. "You're worse," Kellen said without preamble, closing the door behind him. Darien leaned against the edge of the sink, crossing his arms. "Thanks for the diagnosis," he muttered. "Anything useful to add?" Kellen ignored the sarcasm, stepping closer. "The curse is accelerating," he said. "The shadow wolf's influence is spreading. You don't have much time." Darien's jaw clenched. "How long?" Kellen hesitated, and that was answer enough. "I'm holding it back," Darien said, his tone defensive. For now, Kellen said. But you can't keep this up forever. The pack sees the cracks, even if they don't say it. You have to find a way to stop this before it consumes you completely. Darian didn't respond. He couldn't. Because deep down he knew Kellen was right. The training grounds weren't much just a clearing ringed by old oaks, the ground packed hard from years of use. Darian stood at the center, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Saren as she approached. "You're late," he said. "Had to make sure I wasn't walking into another one of your tantrums," Saren said, her tone light but sharp. Darian didn't rise to the bait. He didn't have the energy. Instead, he gestured to the center of the clearing. "Let's get started." Saren raised an eyebrow. "You sure about this? Last time you lost control, it didn't exactly end well." "That's why you're here," Darian said. "Isn't it?" She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she shrugged, stepping into the clearing. "All right," she said. "Let's see what you've got." The first few rounds were easy enough. Saren led him through breathing exercises, her voice calm and steady as she instructed him to focus on his heartbeat, his breath, the feel of the earth beneath his feet. But the shadow wolf didn't like being ignored. It crept in slowly, like a shadow stretching under a setting sun. Darian's hands began to shake, his vision darkening at the edges. The growl started low in his throat, unbidden and uncontrollable. "Stay with me," Saren said, her voice cutting through the haze. Darian's eyes snapped to hers, and for a moment the world seemed to steady. But the shadow wolf wasn't done. The air around him grew heavy, the shadows twisting and curling like smoke. His claws extended, his muscles tensed, and his breathing turned ragged. "Darian," Saren said sharply, stepping closer. "Look at me." He tried, but the shadow wolf was stronger now, pulling him under. Then she started to chant. The words were soft, almost musical, but there was a sharpness to them that cut through the chaos in his mind. Saren's voice wrapped around him like a tether, pulling him back from the brink. The shadows receded, the growl in his throat fading to silence. When he came back to himself, Saren was standing a few feet away, her hand outstretched, the faint glow of moon magic fading from her palm. "What was that?" Darian asked, his voice hoarse. "Something my mother taught me," Saren said, her tone carefully neutral. He stared at her, the weight of what had just happened settling over him. "Why didn't you tell me you could do that?" "Because it's not a solution," Saren said, her gaze hard. "It's a bandage, and bandages don't fix curses." They sat in the clearing for a while after that, the tension between them shifting into something quieter, something heavier. "You can't keep carrying this alone," Saren said finally. Darian let out a bitter laugh. "You think I don't know that? Then stop pretending you have to be invincible," Saren said, her voice sharp. "You're not. And that's fine. But if you keep letting this thing eat away at you, there won't be anything left to save." Her words hit harder than they should have. Darian stared at the ground, his hands clenched into fists. "It's not just the curse," he said finally. "It's the pack. My father built this place from nothing. He made it strong. And now it's falling apart, and they're all looking at me to fix it." "You think you're the only one carrying a legacy?" Saren shot back. "My mother spent her life trying to stop this curse, and it killed her. You're not the only one with ghosts, Darian. You're just louder about it." Her words were harsh, but there was no malice in them, just truth. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The forest was quiet around them, the air still and cool. "Why are you helping me?" Darian asked finally, his voice low. Saren looked at him, her expression softening just slightly. "Because I don't think you're as hopeless as you look," she said, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. Darian let out a short, dry laugh, the sound more genuine than he'd expected. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The tavern at the edge of the settlement was where secrets went to hide in plain sight. Galen sat at a corner table, his shoulders hunched, his eyes flicking to every shadow like he expected them to start whispering back. He'd been watching Saren for weeks, and what he saw didn't sit right. She moved too carefully, spoke too little, and when she did, it was sharp enough to cut. She was hiding something, he was sure of it. Galen leaned forward, his voice low as he spoke to the wolves gathered around him. She's not one of us. She's a rogue with her own agenda, and Darian's too blind to see it. Do you think she's working against him? One of the wolves asked. Think about it, Galen said, his tone biting. The shadow wolf's getting worse. The pack's divided. She shows up, and suddenly everything's supposed to hinge on her. It doesn't add up. His words settled into the room like poison, spreading slow but sure. He didn't need to push hard. Suspicion was already waiting to be fed. Later, when the tavern emptied, Galen slipped into the woods. He stopped at a quiet clearing, his breath visible in the cold night air. A wolf stepped out from the shadows, a scout from the rival pack. Tell your alpha I'm ready, Galen said, his voice steady. The Silverclaw pack won't follow a cursed leader. When the time comes, they'll need someone they can trust. The training session had started like the others, controlled, methodical, the tension between Darian and Saren buried under a thin veneer of focus. But halfway through, something shifted. Darian froze mid-strike, his breath catching. The world around him blurred, the clearing twisting into something darker. Solara appeared, her form ghostly and luminous, her eyes burning with cold fire. You're failing them, she said, her voice echoing in his mind. Your pack is crumbling, and you can't save them. Not with her here. Saren's the only chance I have, Darian shot back, though his voice felt weak, distant. Solara's laughter was sharp, bitter. She will destroy you. Her fate is bound to mine, and the curse will claim you both. The vision shattered as quickly as it had come, leaving Darian on his knees, gasping for air. Saren stood a few feet away, her expression wary. You okay? She asked, her tone guarded. Fine, Darian lied, rising to his feet. Later that night, as Darian wrestled with Solara's warning, Saren sat alone in her quarters. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, the dreams followed. The Moon Queen's voice was soft but relentless, her words threading through Saren's mind like a melody she couldn't escape. It's time, the voice whispered. You cannot run from what you are. Saren woke with a start, her chest tight. The dreams weren't just dreams anymore, they were a summons, and she knew she couldn't ignore them for much longer. Chapter 5. The council hall was built for purpose, not comfort. Stone walls, rough-hewn tables, and torches that threw more shadows than light. It smelled of old wood, smoke, and wolves who'd spent too long in the same room together. Darian sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of control that felt thinner with each passing day. Around him, the council members murmured, their voices low but pointed, their eyes flicking toward Saren as if she were a bad smell they couldn't shake. Let's get on with it, Darian said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. The murmurs quieted, but the tension didn't go anywhere. Galen leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, his expression a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. I think we need to address the elephant in the room, Galen said, his tone casual but loud enough to carry. Or rather, the rogue in the room. All eyes turned to Saren. She was standing near the wall, her arms crossed, her expression sharp and unyielding. Go ahead, she said, her voice dry. Say whatever it is you've been dying to say since I got here. Galen's lips twitched into something that might have been a smirk. It's not about what I want to say. It's about what the pack needs to hear. You're an outsider, Saren. You don't belong here, and yet you're at the center of everything. The curse, the shadow wolf, our alpha's instability. Darian's jaw tightened, but Saren got there first. Instability? She said, stepping forward. You mean the thing that's been plaguing your pack for generations, long before I got here? That instability? A ripple of discomfort moved through the room, but Galen didn't flinch. You don't understand our ways, Galen said. You don't understand what it takes to lead a pack like this. And you do? Saren shot back, her tone sharp. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the only thing you're leading is a mutiny. The room froze. Darian's eyes snapped to Galen, but the beta recovered quickly, shaking his head with a practiced laugh. "That's a bold accusation," Galen said, his voice calm but cold. "Careful with those, rogue. They tend to come back to bite." Saren didn't back down. "I call it like I see it," she said. "And what I see is a pack that's being pulled apart from the inside." The council erupted into murmurs again, louder this time, the air thick with unease. Saren's gaze swept the room, catching the way some of the wolves avoided her eyes, the way others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. She turned to Darian, her voice cutting through the noise. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about trust. And if you can't trust the wolves sitting in this room, then your problem isn't a curse, it's betrayal." Darian rose from his seat, his hands flat on the table. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. "That's enough," he said. The council fell quiet, but the tension lingered, coiling tighter with each passing second. "Galen," Darian said, his gaze fixed on his beta. "Do you have something to say?" Galen's smirk faltered, but only slightly. "I'm just looking out for the pack," he said. "It's what you expect of me, isn't it?" "I expect loyalty," Darian said. "Anything less is treason." The room held its breath. For a moment it looked like Galen might push back, but then he nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Of course," he said smoothly. "You'll have no complaints from me, Alpha." Darian's eyes lingered on him for a beat longer before he turned to the rest of the council. "This meeting is over," he said. The wolves began to file out, their voices low, their eyes darting between Darian and Saren. Galen was the last to leave, pausing in the doorway just long enough to cast a glance over his shoulder. Saren caught the look, her eyes narrowing. She didn't miss the calculation in it, the hint of something darker lurking just beneath the surface. "He's planning something," she said once the room was empty, turning to Darian. "You think I don't know that?" Darian said, his voice tight. "Then do something about it," she said, stepping closer. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I am," he said. Saren watched him for a moment longer, then nodded, turning to leave. But as she reached the door, she paused, her hand resting on the frame. "You might want to consider trusting someone other than yourself, Alpha," she said without looking back. "Because if Galen's not the traitor you think he is, someone else will be." And with that, she was gone, leaving Darian alone in the council hall, the weight of her words settling over him like a storm cloud. The patrol had started out routine, or as routine as things got in a pack teetering on the edge of chaos. The forest stretched wide and dark around them, the moonlight splintering through the trees in broken shards. Saren walked near the middle of the group, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows while the others focused more on her than the terrain. The wolves didn't trust her, and they didn't bother hiding it. She didn't mind. Trust was a luxury, and luxuries got you killed. The ambush came quick, snapping the quiet like a branch underfoot. The first rogue hit from above, dropping out of the trees onto the lead warrior. The second and third followed, their snarls ripping through the air as the patrol scattered. Saren didn't hesitate. Her knife was in her hand before her heart had time to skip a beat. "Stay together." One of the warriors barked, his voice tight with panic. "Staying together gets us killed," Saren shot back, already moving. The clearing erupted into chaos. Saren darted through the fray, her blade flashing as she slashed at the flank of a rogue lunging toward one of the younger warriors. Blood sprayed, dark against the moonlight, and the rogue crumpled with a snarl. She didn't stop to revel in the victory. Her eyes swept the scene, catching every movement, every threat. That's when she saw it, the insignia. It was faint, half hidden under the rogue's matted fur, but unmistakable. A jagged slash through a crescent moon. Saren's stomach tightened. She'd seen that mark before, years ago, in the territory of a rival pack. "Focus," a warrior barked, snapping her attention back to the fight. Saren pushed the thought aside, throwing herself into the chaos. Her movements were fluid, precise, every strike calculated to wound or disable. She didn't fight to kill. She fought to survive. and she fought to keep them all alive. When it was over, the rogues lay scattered in the clearing, their bodies broken and still. The warriors regrouped, their breaths ragged, their eyes darting nervously between Saren and the bodies. What the hell was that? One of them muttered, wiping blood from his blade. An ambush, Saren said, crouching beside the rogue with the insignia. She pulled the fur aside, exposing the mark fully. And not a random one. The warriors gathered around her, their expressions a mix of confusion and unease. "That's Cassian's mark," one of them said, his voice low. "Rival pack," Saren said, her tone sharp. "What are his wolves doing this deep in Silverclaw territory?" No one answered, but Saren didn't need them to. The tension in the air was answer enough. Back at the pack's settlement, Saren wasted no time. She found Galen near the training grounds, his arms crossed, his face set in an expression of feigned disinterest. "Care to explain why Cassian's rogues were waiting for us in the forest?" she asked, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. Galen's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb," Saren snapped. One of them was wearing his mark. "Cassian's been encroaching for months," Galen said, his tone even. "That's not news." "No, it's not," Saren said, stepping closer. "But what is news is how they knew exactly where we'd be. Almost like someone told them." Galen's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a flicker Saren didn't miss. "You're out of line," he said, his voice sharp. "Accusing your beta without proof? That's a dangerous game. And covering for a traitor is worse," Saren shot back. Darien found them like that, locked in a battle of wills that was quickly drawing a crowd. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the pack. Saren turned to him, her jaw tight. "Ask your beta," she said. "Ask him why Cassian's rogues knew where to find us." Darien's eyes flicked to Galen, his expression darkening. "I don't have to explain myself to a rogue," Galen said, his voice cold. "No, but you do have to explain yourself to me," Darien said, his tone deadly. The tension of the day followed Saren into the night, coiling around her like a second skin. She lay in her quarters, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Sleep came reluctantly, dragging her into its depths with heavy hands, and with it came the dream. The Moon Queen stood in a sea of darkness, her form radiant and untouchable. Saren felt like a child in her presence, small and insignificant. "You cannot run from what you are," the Queen said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm not running," Saren said, though the words felt hollow. The Queen's gaze pierced her, and the darkness around them shifted, revealing flashes of a memory Saren didn't recognize. A woman, her face familiar yet distant, kneeling before an ancient altar. "Your mother sought to end the curse," the Queen said, "but she failed. And in her failure, she bound you to my will." Saren's breath caught. "What does that mean?" "It means you are the key," the Queen said, "but you cannot unlock what you do not understand." The vision shifted again, this time showing a crumbling temple hidden in the mountains. "You must go where she went," the Queen said. "Finish what she started." Saren woke with a start, her chest heaving, her mind racing. The dream had felt too real to dismiss, too vivid to ignore. The next morning she found Darien in the training grounds, his expression as weary as hers felt. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "What now?" he asked, his tone sharp. "I know how to break the curse," Saren said. "But we need to find the temple in the mountains." Darien's eyes narrowed, but he didn't argue. Instead, he nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. "Then let's go," he said. For the first time since she'd joined the pack, Saren felt a flicker of hope. The Silverclaw camp always felt different at night. Shadows stretched longer, the air carried a quiet hum of tension, and the wolves moved with purpose, even in their sleep. But tonight, something was off. It wasn't just the usual stillness, it was heavier, sharper, like the camp was holding its breath. Darien felt it before he saw it. He'd been restless, pacing near the training grounds when the wind shifted, carrying with it a scent that didn't belong. Blood, smoke, and something darker. The first shout came from the eastern edge of the camp. Rogues. Darien was already moving, his claws half shifted, his instincts kicking in like they'd been waiting for this. Wolves scrambled out of their dens, weapons drawn, the camp erupting into chaos. The rogues moved fast and brutal, shadows with teeth, slipping through the defenses like they knew exactly where to hit. And maybe they did. Siren was in the middle of the fray before anyone could stop her. She moved like a force of nature, her knives flashing in the moonlight, her strikes quick and deliberate. She wasn't fighting to prove anything, she was fighting to survive, and she was good at it. Darien caught sight of her through the chaos, her dark hair a wild blur as she took down one rogue after another. For a moment he felt a flicker of something close to admiration, but it was short-lived, because then he saw Galen. The Beta was standing near the edge of the camp, his expression a mix of anger and something darker. He wasn't fighting, he was watching, his sharp eyes darting between the rogues and Siren. And then he shouted, "The rogue brought them here. Siren's working with them." The words cut through the chaos like a blade. Wolves froze mid-motion, their eyes snapping to Siren, suspicion and fear blooming in their expressions. Siren spun toward Galen, her face twisting in anger. "You lying bastard. She's been against us from the start," Galen shouted, stepping forward. "Think about it, how else would the rogues know where to hit? She's been feeding them information." Darien's blood went cold. The wolves around him murmured, the weight of Galen's words spreading like wildfire. "That's not true." Siren snapped, her voice rising over the noise. "You know damn well I'd never you expect us to believe you." Galen sneered, cutting her off. "You're a rogue, Siren. You don't belong here, and you never have." "Enough." Darien's voice roared through the camp, silencing the murmurs instantly. He stepped into the center of the clearing, his eyes locked on Galen. "You're out of line," he growled. Galen met his gaze, his expression hard. "Am I? Or are you too blinded by her to see the truth?" Darien didn't flinch. "The only one I can't trust right now is you." The Beta's mask slipped for just a moment, a flicker of panic, quickly replaced by defiance. But Darien saw it. "You knew this attack was coming," Darien said, his voice low and dangerous. "Didn't you?" Galen's lips twitched into a smirk, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're grasping at straws, Alpha." "Then why weren't you fighting?" Siren cut in, stepping closer. "Why were you standing back and watching while your pack bled?" Galen turned on her, his anger flaring. "Because I knew you'd pull something like this." "That's enough," Darien said again, his tone icy. The camp was silent now, every wolf watching, waiting. Darien stepped closer to Galen, his gray eyes burning. "I trusted you," he said, his voice low but steady. "You were supposed to have my back." "And I did," Galen snapped. "Until you started putting this rogue above the pack." "This isn't about her," Darien said, his tone sharp. "This is about you. You've been undermining me for weeks, spreading rumors, stirring up fear. And now this." He gestured to the chaos around them. "This wasn't an accident." Galen opened his mouth to argue, but Darien cut him off. "Save it. I know the truth." The silence that followed was suffocating. Galen's gaze darted around the camp, looking for support, but the wolves around him were still, their expressions cold. "Darien," Galen said finally, his tone softer, almost pleading. "You don't understand. Cassian's pack." "I don't care about Cassian's pack," Darien growled. "I care about mine. And you just proved you don't." Galen's shoulders sagged for a moment, but then his smirk returned, bitter and defiant. "Fine," he said. "You want the truth. Cassian's going to hit you during the blood moon ritual. And when he does, this pack will fall apart because you're too weak to stop him." Darien didn't respond. He didn't need to. "Get out," he said, his voice cold as steel. Galen blinked, caught off guard. "What? You're banished," Darien said. "Leave now, or I'll make sure you don't leave at all." For a moment it looked like Galen might fight, but then he laughed, low and bitter, shaking his head. "You'll regret this," he said. "Maybe," Darien said, "but at least I won't regret trusting you." Galen spat on the ground, then turned and walked into the shadows, disappearing into the forest. The camp was quiet for a long moment. Then the wolves began to move, cleaning up the aftermath of the attack. Darian stood in the clearing, his chest tight, his mind racing. Siren stepped up beside him, her expression unreadable. "You did the right thing," she said. "Did I?" he asked, his voice quiet. "You don't have time to doubt it," she said. "Not with what's coming." Darian turned to her, his jaw tight. "Then we'd better get moving," he said. "To the temple?" Siren asked. "To the temple," Darian confirmed. And with that, they turned toward the unknown, knowing the blood moon was closer than ever. Chapter 6. The path to the temple wasn't much of a path at all. The forest pressed in from every side, its twisted branches clawing at the thin strip of sky above. The ground was uneven, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. It was the kind of place that didn't want to be traveled, and it made its feelings clear with every step. Darian led the way, his movements steady but deliberate, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows. Siren followed close behind, her boots crunching softly against the leaves. She didn't complain about the pace, though she had plenty of opportunities to. She wasn't the complaining type, not when it mattered. They'd been walking for hours, the silence between them broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the distant rustle of something moving in the underbrush. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't exactly friendly either. It was tentative. They stopped at the edge of a ravine, the narrow trail giving way to a steep drop that disappeared into shadows. Darian paused, his hand resting lightly on a tree for balance as he surveyed the terrain. "This is where it gets tricky," he said, his voice low. Siren stepped up beside him, her eyes flicking to the ravine before landing on him. "Tricky or impossible? Depends on how badly you want to get there," he said, glancing at her. She smirked, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I didn't come this far to turn around." "Good," he said, his tone softening just slightly, "because there's no turning back now." The descent was slow and careful, every step deliberate, every handhold tested before they trusted it. The rocks were slick, the moss treacherous, but they made it down without incident. The air at the bottom of the ravine was cooler, heavier, and the shadows seemed thicker somehow. Darian's senses were on high alert, his muscles coiled, his instincts humming with the faint, persistent warning that something wasn't right. It wasn't long before his suspicions were confirmed. The first rogue came at them from the side, its growl cutting through the stillness like a knife. Darian reacted instantly, his blade flashing as he turned to meet the attack. "Get behind me," he barked at Siren, but she was already moving. "I'm not a damsel," she snapped, drawing her own knife. They fought side by side, their movements quick and brutal. Siren was faster than he'd expected, her strikes precise, her focus unshakable. She didn't just hold her own, she thrived in the chaos, her defiance sharp enough to cut through the fear that clung to the air. By the time the last rogue fell, the clearing was quiet again, the shadows retreating like they'd had their fill. Darian wiped his blade on the grass, his breath steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. Siren stood nearby, leaning against a tree, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. "Not bad," he said, his tone grudgingly impressed. "Not bad," she echoed, raising an eyebrow. "I just saved your ass, Alpha." He smirked, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. "I had it under control." "Sure you did," she said, but there was no bite in her words. They started moving again, slower this time, their steps more deliberate. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the forest began to change. The air grew thinner, the trees sparser, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground was harder here, the path less forgiving, and the silence felt heavier somehow. They stopped near a cluster of rocks, the fading light painting the landscape in shades of gold and gray. Darian started a small fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows across the ground. Siren sat across from him, her knees drawn up, her eyes fixed on the flames. "You're quiet," he said after a while. She glanced at him, her expression guarded. "Just thinking." "About?" She hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her jacket. "About my mother," she said finally, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. Darian didn't say anything, didn't push. He just waited. She spent her whole life chasing something she couldn't catch, Suzanne said, her gaze distant. She thought she could stop the curse, that she could fix everything. But it killed her in the end. I'm sorry, Darian said, his voice quiet. Suzanne shrugged, though the motion was tense. She was stubborn. It runs in the family. He smiled faintly. I've noticed. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling softly between them. You know, Suzanne said, her tone lighter for an alpha, you're not half as bad as I expected. Darian raised an eyebrow. High praise. She smirked, the tension in her face easing just a bit. Don't let it go to your head. He leaned back, his gaze lifting to the stars that had begun to peek through the twilight. I didn't want this, you know, he said after a moment. What? Being alpha, he said. It wasn't supposed to be me. My father, he had this way of making everything seem easy, like he didn't have to try. And then he was gone, and suddenly it was my job to hold everything together. Suzanne watched him, her expression softening. And do you? She asked. Hold it together? He let out a short, humorless laugh. Some days it feels like I'm holding on by a thread. The firelight danced in her green eyes as she looked at him, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. You're still here, aren't you? He met her gaze, something shifting in the air between them. Yeah, he said. I am. For a moment, the weight of everything, the curse, the pack, the shadow wolf felt a little lighter. But the moment passed, and the shadows crept back in. We should get some rest, Darian said, his tone practical, though his gaze lingered on her for just a second too long. Suzanne nodded, but as she lay down, her mind was far from quiet. The temple was close now, and with it, the answers they both needed. She just wasn't sure either of them was ready for what they'd find. The temple was more ruin than sanctuary, its crumbling walls leaning against each other like old soldiers too proud to fall. The moon hung heavy and low above it, its pale light painting the jagged edges in silver. The air was thinner here, sharp and cold, carrying a weight that pressed against their chests with every breath. Darian and Suzanne stood at the center of the crumbling courtyard, the ancient altar looming between them. The stone was dark, flecked with what looked like shards of silver embedded deep into its surface. At its center rested a smooth, rounded moonstone, glowing faintly as though it was alive. This is it, Suzanne said, her voice barely above a whisper. Darian's gaze swept the ruins, his expression tight. Doesn't feel like a place for answers, he said. Feels like a place where things go to die. Maybe both, Suzanne said, stepping toward the altar. Her fingers hovered over the moonstone, hesitating for a moment before brushing its surface. The stone flared to life under her touch, its glow spreading in ripples like light dancing on water. The air shifted, the weight of it thickening, until it felt like the temple was holding its breath. What happens now? Darian asked, his voice low. Suzanne glanced at him, her green eyes sharp. We follow where it leads. The moment their hands touched the moonstone together, the world dissolved. The temple, the ruins, the cold night air, it all fell away, replaced by a swirling void of light and shadow. They were weightless, suspended in the middle of something too vast to comprehend. Then the vision took shape. They stood in a forest, its trees blackened and twisted, the ground scorched as though fire had raged through it. The air smelled of ash and despair. At the center of it all was Solara. She stood by a shattered altar, her silver hair whipping in a wind they couldn't feel. Her eyes glowed with a mix of fury and sorrow, her hands clutching at her chest like she was holding herself together. Why did you betray me? She whispered, her voice echoing like thunder. A man stepped forward, tall and commanding, his face hard with ambition. Darian recognized him immediately, the first alpha of the Silverclaw pack. His features were sharp, his presence imposing, but his eyes held no warmth. You were holding me back, the man said, his tone cold. Your love made me weak. Solara's expression twisted, her pain visible even through the haze of the vision. I gave you everything, she said, her voice breaking. And now you'll give me your silence, he said, turning away. The scene shifted violently, pulling them forward like they were being yanked by an invisible thread. Solara knelt before a pool of dark water, her reflection distorted and fragmented. She raised her hands, and the water began to ripple, glowing with a faint, unnatural light. "I call upon the moon," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Grant me the power to right this wrong." The water exploded upward, twisting into the shape of a wolf black as midnight, its eyes burning red. Darian's breath caught in his throat. The shadow wolf. "Give me your strength," Solara said, her voice cracking. "Make him suffer as I have suffered. Make all who follow him bear the weight of his betrayal." The wolf howled, its voice a sound that shook the vision itself. Solara's form wavered, her body seeming to dissolve into the wolf as it lunged forward, disappearing into the darkness. The vision shifted again, slower this time. They were back in the temple, but it wasn't ruined now. It was whole, glowing with an otherworldly light. Solara stood before them, her face calm but her eyes haunted. "You've seen my pain," she said, her voice softer now. "You've seen what was done to me. But what I created, it was worse." "The shadow wolf," Darian said, his voice rough. Solara nodded. "It is my rage, my despair. It is the curse that binds your bloodline, Darian, and it will never be undone until one of you proves that love can be stronger than betrayal." She turned to Saren, her glowing eyes locking onto hers. "And you?" she said. "You are the key." Saren's breath caught, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" "You carry the remnants of my power," Solara said. "Your mother tried to stop the curse, but her ritual was incomplete. That power passed to you, binding you to the moon's will." "No," Saren said, shaking her head. "I didn't ask for this." "Destiny rarely asks," Solara said, "but the choice is still yours. The curse can only be broken through true, selfless love. And to prove that love, one must be willing to sacrifice everything." Saren's throat tightened. "You mean I have to die?" Solara's gaze didn't waver. "To break the cycle, to end the shadow wolf's reign, a life must be given freely. The blood moon will see to that." The vision began to fade, the light dimming around them. Darian reached out, his voice desperate. "Wait. There has to be another way." Solara's eyes softened, but her form was already dissolving. "Find the strength to love beyond fear, Darian. It is the only way." And then she was gone, and the weight of her words settled over them like a storm cloud. They woke in the temple, their hands still on the moonstone, their breaths coming fast and shallow. Saren pulled her hand away, stepping back as though the stone had burned her. "I didn't ask for this," she said again, her voice trembling. Darian stood, his gaze locked on her. "We'll find another way," he said, his voice firm. But even as he said it, he knew the truth was more complicated than that. The blood moon was coming, and with it, a choice neither of them was ready to make. The air in the temple courtyard was wrong. It had been heavy before, thick with the weight of the ritual, but now it was suffocating. The moon, bright and full just moments ago, was obscured by a creeping shadow that seemed to crawl across its surface. Darian felt it first. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and a low growl rumbled deep in his chest. His senses prickled with the unmistakable scent of something ancient and dangerous, something that didn't belong in this world. "Do you feel that?" Saren asked, her voice tight, her green eyes scanning the shadows that pooled around the crumbling temple walls. Darian nodded, his hand instinctively gripping the hilt of his blade. "It's here." The words hadn't fully left his mouth before the darkness surged forward, coalescing into a shape that sent a cold spike of dread through him. The shadow wolf stepped out of the gloom, its form massive and unnatural. Its black fur shimmered like liquid smoke, and its red eyes burned with a malice that felt older than the ground beneath their feet. Its growl was low and guttural, a sound that rattled the stones of the temple itself. "Darian Silverclaw," the shadow wolf said, its voice a deep, echoing snarl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You think you can defy me?" The wolf lunged, faster than anything that size had a right to be. Darian barely had time to push Saren out of the way before the creature's claws slashed through the air where she'd been standing. "Run," he barked, drawing his blade. But Saren didn't run. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes blazing with defiance. I'm not leaving you. The shadow wolf laughed, a harsh, hollow sound that made Darian's chest tighten. How noble, it sneered. But you'll fail, just as all your bloodline has failed before you. Darian charged, his blade arcing through the air in a silver flash. The weapon bit into the shadow wolf's flank, but instead of blood, a swirling black mist poured from the wound. The creature didn't falter. It turned on him with a feral snarl, its massive paw striking out and sending him crashing into the temple wall. Saren moved then, her knives drawn, her movements quick and precise. She darted in and out, her blades cutting through the creature's form, but every strike seemed to do little more than annoy it. Is this all you have? The shadow wolf taunted, its eyes locking onto Darian as he staggered to his feet. You are weak, just like your father. Unworthy of the power you claim to hold. Unworthy of her. Darian's chest heaved, his grip on his blade tightening. Shut up, he growled, his voice low and dangerous. The shadow wolf stepped closer, its red eyes narrowing. Do you think she'll save you? Do you think she'll stay when she learns the truth? You can't protect her. You can't even protect yourself. Enough. Saren's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. She stepped forward, her hands raised, the faint glow of moonlight gathering around her. The shadow wolf hesitated, its gaze snapping to her as the light grew brighter, stronger. You want me? Saren said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. I'm the one tied to the Moon Queen. Leave him out of this. The shadow wolf snarled, its form flickering as though it couldn't decide whether to attack or retreat. You don't understand what you've bound yourself to, Rogu, it spat. The moon's power will destroy you. Maybe, Saren said, her voice unwavering. But not tonight. She closed her eyes, her lips moving in a soft chant that Darian recognized from their earlier training sessions. The glow around her intensified, bathing the courtyard in silvery light that made the shadow wolf recoil. The creature howled, its voice a mixture of rage and pain, as the light pierced through its form. It lunged at Saren, but the moonlight flared brighter, forcing it back. Saren, stop. Darian shouted, his voice raw. It's going to kill you. She didn't stop. Her chant grew louder, the light around her pulsating like a heartbeat. The shadow wolf's form began to dissolve, its growls turning into shrieks as it was forced back into the shadows. Finally, with one last howl, the creature vanished, the darkness retreating into the edges of the temple. The silence that followed was deafening. Saren swayed on her feet, her breathing shallow, her skin pale. Darian was at her side in an instant, his arms steadying her before she could collapse. Saren, he said, his voice filled with both relief and worry. I'm fine, she said, though her voice was barely a whisper. No, you're not, he said, his grip tightening. She looked up at him, her green eyes glassy but determined. It's not gone, she said. It's still out there, and it's not going to stop. Darian's jaw tightened, his gaze sweeping the shadows as though expecting the creature to return at any moment. Then we'll be ready for it, he said, his voice firm. Saren shook her head. This isn't something you fight, Darian. It's something you break. Her words hung in the air, heavy and final. As the moon emerged from behind the clouds, its light bathing the ruined temple once more, Darian felt the weight of what they were up against settle fully on his shoulders. The shadow wolf wasn't just a monster, it was a mirror, reflecting everything he feared about himself. And for the first time he wasn't sure if he had the strength to shatter it. The temple courtyard was quieter now, the weight of the shadow wolf's attack hanging in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Saren sat on the edge of the ancient altar, her hands resting on her knees, her gaze fixed on the faint glow of the moonstone still nestled in its cracked surface. Darian stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, his eyes never straying far from her. The fight had left him battered, his knuckles bruised, his shirt torn, but the tension in his shoulders wasn't from the battle. It was from her. You're hiding something, he said, his voice low but certain. Saren didn't look at him. You're imagining things? Alpha. No, I'm not, he said, stepping closer. Ever since the ritual, you've been different. I just helped you survive an attack from your cursed family shadow, she said, her tone sharper than she meant it to be. That tends to take it out of a person. Darian's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He watched her for a moment longer, then turned away, his gaze sweeping the temple ruins as if they might offer answers she wouldn't. Saren let out a slow breath, her fingers curling into fists. She could still feel the pull of the moonstone, the faint echo of Solara's words reverberating in her chest. A life must be given freely. She hadn't told Darian the full truth, and she wasn't going to. Not yet, not until it was too late for him to stop her, because she knew him now. Knew his stubbornness, his loyalty, the way he carried the weight of his pack like it was his alone to bear. If he found out what the ritual really required, he'd try to stop her. And she couldn't let him. Saren, Darian said, breaking the silence. She glanced up, meeting his stormy gray eyes. Why did you come here? He asked, his voice quieter now. To this pack, to this mess. Why didn't you just stay hidden? Her lips twitched into a faint smirk. Because the shadow wolf would have found me anyway. It's not exactly the type to respect boundaries. He shook his head, his expression softening. That's not what I mean. The smirk faded, and for a moment, Saren considered telling him the truth. About the curse. About the price. About the way her mother's unfinished ritual had tied her to a destiny she'd never wanted. But the words wouldn't come. Because someone had to, she said instead, her tone more bitter than she intended. Darian studied her for a long moment, his gaze steady, searching. Then he nodded, as if he'd found the answer he was looking for, even if she hadn't given it to him. The journey back to the Silverclaw territory was slow and quiet. The forest seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, the air colder. Darian stayed close, his presence a steady, grounding weight against the growing unease in her chest. By the time they reached the edge of the pack's territory, the moon was high, its light cutting through the trees in sharp beams. You should rest, Darian said as they approached the camp. You've done more than enough. Saren nodded, though she knew rest wouldn't come. That night the dream came. She stood in the temple again, though it was whole now, its walls glowing with the soft, silvery light of the moon. Solara was there, her form more solid this time, her silver hair flowing like water. You've made your choice, Solara said, her voice soft but heavy with meaning. I don't have a choice, Saren said, her voice steady despite the weight in her chest. Solara stepped closer, her glowing eyes locking onto Saren's. There is always a choice, she said, but the price of this one is steep. Saren swallowed hard. What do you want from me? It's not about what I want, Solara said, her voice almost gentle. It's about what you're willing to give. The curse can only be broken through the purest act of love. A love that demands nothing in return. A love that sacrifices everything. Saren's throat tightened. I know. Solara studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Be strong, Saren Moonshade. The blood moon will ask for more than you think you can give. When Saren woke, her chest ached like she'd been holding her breath for hours. The sky outside her window was just beginning to lighten, the first rays of dawn spilling over the horizon. She sat up, her hand resting over her heart as if it might hold her together. The blood moon was coming, and with it, the end of everything she'd ever known. But she wouldn't stop. She couldn't. Chapter 7. The blood moon rose like an open wound in the night sky, its crimson light spilling over the Silverclaw territory like a warning. The trees cast jagged shadows across the ground, and the air was thick with something unspoken, something that set every wolf on edge. Darian stood at the edge of the grand hall, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The blood-red light painted harsh lines across his face, deepening the shadows under his eyes. The pack was gathered in the central clearing, their murmurs hushed, their movements cautious. It wasn't just the ritual that had them uneasy. The wind carried a faint scent, smoke and steel, faint but unmistakable. The rival pack was out there, waiting, watching, ready to strike. Darian could feel it like a storm brewing on the edge of his senses. He turned to Ronan, his beta now that Galen was gone. The stocky wolf stood a few paces behind him, his face grim. "They'll come," Darian said, his voice low. Ronan nodded. "We're ready." "Are we?" Darian asked, though the question wasn't meant for Ronan. In the clearing, the pack moved restlessly. Warriors sharpened their blades, their eyes darting to the shadows. The younger wolves clustered together, their fear thinly veiled by forced bravado. And in the center of it all was Siren. She stood near the altar, her dark hair catching the bloodlight, her expression unreadable. She was a contradiction, calm but tense, quiet but buzzing with a kind of energy that made it impossible to look away. Darian's eyes found her like they always did, drawn to her despite himself. He'd seen her fight, seen her stand her ground when others would have run. But this was different. She looked like she was saying goodbye. Siren's fingers brushed over the surface of the altar, her thoughts far away. The stone felt cold and smooth under her touch, but the weight in her chest was anything but. She'd made her choice. The pack needed her to break the curse, and the curse demanded a sacrifice. It was simple math, really. One life for the many, one heartbeat for the survival of the pack. She just wished it didn't feel so heavy. Darian approached her, his footsteps quiet but deliberate. She didn't look up, but she felt him there, his presence as steady as the ground beneath her feet. "You ready?" he asked, his voice softer than she expected. Siren nodded, her gaze still on the altar. "Are you?" He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Not even close." She glanced at him then, her green eyes sharp but not unkind. "You'll be fine," she said. "You sound pretty sure of that," he said, his tone light but his eyes searching hers. "Someone has to be," she said, turning back to the altar. The pack began to gather closer, the murmurs fading into silence as the weight of the moment settled over them. Elder Lydia stepped forward, her silver hair gleaming in the moonlight, her expression solemn. "The time has come," she said, her voice carrying over the clearing. "The blood moon calls for the ritual to begin." Darian stepped forward, his shoulders squared, his jaw tight. He glanced at Siren, his eyes searching hers for something reassurance, maybe, or a sign that she was as uncertain as he was. But Siren didn't flinch. She didn't waver. She just nodded, her resolve as unyielding as the stone beneath her feet. As Lydia began the incantation, the red light of the blood moon seemed to grow brighter, sharper, cutting through the clearing like a blade. The air grew heavier, thick with the weight of something ancient and alive. Darian felt it settle over him, pressing against his chest, his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that the ground itself was holding its breath. His wolves stood at the edges of the clearing, their weapons ready, their eyes darting to the forest beyond. They knew. They all knew. The rival pack was coming. Siren's voice joined Lydia's, her chant weaving through the air like a thread of light cutting through the darkness. The moonstone on the altar began to glow, its pale light shifting to a deep crimson as the ritual drew its power from the blood moon. Darian's gaze snapped to the shadows beyond the clearing, his senses straining. He could feel the rival pack moving, their presence like a weight pressing against his skin. "Ronan," he said, his voice low but commanding. Ronan stepped up beside him, his blade in hand. "They're close." "Keep them back," Darian said, his eyes flicking to Siren. "No matter what happens, keep them back." As the ritual's energy built, Siren's voice grew stronger, her chant rising above the silence like a beacon. The moonstone pulsed with light, its glow spreading outward, bathing the clearing in a crimson haze. Darian's heart raced, the tension in his chest building with every passing second. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew one thing for certain: this night would end in blood, and he just hoped it wouldn't be hers. The first sign was the wind. It shifted abruptly, carrying with it a scent that didn't belong. Blood, steel, and betrayal. Darian stiffened, his hand tightening on the hilt of his blade as his eyes swept the tree line surrounding the clearing. "Something's wrong," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Ronan, standing a step behind him, nodded grimly. "They're here." Before the words had fully left his mouth, the attack came. The forest exploded with movement, wolves bursting from the shadows, their eyes wild, their snarls ripping through the night. They came fast and without mercy, their weapons gleaming in the crimson light of the blood moon. The rival pack had arrived, and at their head was Galen. "Hold the line," Darian shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The Silverclaw warriors surged forward, their formation tightening as they met the onslaught. Blades clashed, claws raked, and the clearing descended into a maelstrom of violence. Galen moved through the chaos like he was born to it, his sandy blonde hair catching the bloodlight, his smirk as sharp as the blade in his hand. He wasn't just leading the attack, he was reveling in it. Darian's eyes locked on him, and for a moment the rest of the battle faded into the background. "Galen," he roared, charging toward the traitorous Beta. Galen turned, his smirk widening as he raised his blade to meet Darian's. The clash was immediate and brutal. Darian's strikes were heavy, driven by fury and betrayal, but Galen was fast, his movements calculated, his smirk never wavering. "This is your fault, Darian," Galen said, his voice cutting through the sounds of battle. "You brought this on yourself. You betrayed your pack," Darian snarled, his blade arcing through the air. "They were never my pack," Galen spat, sidestepping the blow and countering with a strike that Darian barely blocked in time. "They were yours, and you failed them." Across the clearing, Siren stood at the altar, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. The moonstone pulsed with energy, its light growing brighter with every word of the ritual. She didn't look up as the battle raged around her. She couldn't. The ritual demanded her full focus, her full strength. But then the shadows shifted, and the air grew colder. Siren's chant faltered as she sensed the movement behind her. Too late to react. A hand grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the altar with a force that sent her stumbling. She turned, her knives already in her hands, but it wasn't enough. Galen's forces had reached her. The warrior who grabbed her was massive, his grip like iron as he yanked her away from the altar. Siren fought, her blades flashing as she twisted and slashed, but more hands joined the first, pulling her down, restraining her. She snarled, her wolf rising to the surface, but the weight of the attackers was too much. "Siren!" Darian's voice tore through the clearing, raw with panic and fury. He turned, abandoning his fight with Galen as his eyes locked on Siren, struggling against her captors. "Go ahead," Galen said, his voice smug as he wiped blood from the corner of his mouth. "Run to her. See how far you get." Darian didn't hesitate. He moved, cutting through the chaos like a blade through water, his focus singular. But the rival pack was ready for him. Wolves surged forward, blocking his path, their snarls and strikes forcing him to slow. He fought like a man possessed, every strike deadly, every move precise, but the numbers were against him. Across the clearing, Siren was dragged to the edge of the forest, her captors holding her arms as she thrashed and cursed. "Let me go," she snarled, her voice sharp and defiant. One of the wolves laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. "Not likely, rogue. You're the leverage now." Darian broke through the line of wolves, his blade dripping with blood, his chest heaving. "Siren," he shouted again, his voice cracking with desperation. Galen stepped into his path, his smirk widening. "You're too late, Alpha," he said, his tone mocking. "She's ours now." Darian lunged, his blade aimed for Galen's heart, but the traitorous Beta sidestepped, his laughter ringing out over the clearing. "You can't save her," Galen said, his voice low and venomous. "Not this time." Darian's chest heaved, his grip on his blade tightening. "I will find you," he said, his voice shaking with rage, "and I will end you." Galen's smirk didn't falter. "We'll see, Alpha," he said, stepping back into the shadows. "We'll see." And with that, he was gone, disappearing into the darkness with Siren and his forces. The clearing fell into a tense, eerie silence, broken only by the heavy breathing of the surviving wolves. Darian stood in the center of it all, his blade still in his hand, his chest heaving, his mind racing. They had Siren. and the blood moon was still rising. The forest was a battlefield. Blood stained the earth, and the air was thick with snarls, shouts, and the clash of steel. But none of it registered for Darien. Not the wolves locked in combat, not the trees that blurred past him as he sprinted. There was only one thing that mattered now: Saren. Her scent, faint but distinct, cut through the chaos, leading him deeper into the forest. Every step felt heavier, every breath harder to draw. The shadow wolf was there, just beneath the surface, clawing to break free. Darien didn't have the strength to hold it back much longer. He found them in a clearing, the moon's red light bathing the scene in an eerie glow. Saren was on her knees, her hands bound behind her back, her face defiant even as blood trickled from a cut on her temple. Galen stood over her, his blade resting casually on her shoulder, his smirk as sharp as the edge of his weapon. "You took your time, Alpha," Galen said, his voice dripping with mockery. Darien didn't answer. He couldn't. The sight of Saren bound, bleeding, vulnerable ignited something in him, something dark and primal. His vision blurred, the edges tinged with red. The shadow wolf surged forward, a growl tearing from his throat that wasn't entirely his own. "Darien," Saren said, her voice steady despite the situation. "Don't." But it was too late. The transformation hit like a storm, sudden and violent. Darien fell to his knees, his body convulsing as the shadow wolf took hold. His claws elongated, his muscles rippling as black mist began to pour from his skin, curling around him like smoke. When he rose, it wasn't Darien anymore. The shadow wolf stood in his place, its red eyes burning with fury, its growl low and menacing. Galen's smirk faltered. He stepped back, his grip on his blade tightening. What is this?" The shadow wolf didn't answer. It lunged, faster than Galen could react. The beta barely managed to dodge, the wolf's claws slicing through the air where his chest had been a moment before. "Darien," Saren shouted, struggling against her bonds. But the shadow wolf didn't hear her. Or if it did, it didn't care. It turned on Galen again, its growl deepening as it stalked toward him. Galen's bravado was gone now, replaced by pure, unfiltered fear. "You can't control this," Galen shouted, his voice shaking. "It'll kill us all." The wolf lunged again, and this time Galen wasn't fast enough. Its claws raked across his chest, sending him sprawling to the ground. Blood splattered the dirt, and Galen scrambled backward, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. "Darien, stop." Saren's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and desperate. The shadow wolf froze, its head snapping toward her. For a moment, its gaze locked onto hers, and she saw something there: rage, yes, but also pain. It was as if the wolf itself was struggling, caught between its anger and something deeper. Saren took a shaky breath, her voice softening. "This isn't you." The wolf growled, its form flickering as if it couldn't decide whether to stay or fade. "You don't have to do this," Saren said, her green eyes steady. "You're stronger than this." "I know you are." The wolf snarled, stepping closer to her, its red eyes glowing brighter. Saren didn't flinch. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice calm. "If you want to take me, then take me. But I'm not going to fight you." The wolf hesitated, its growl faltering. Saren leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone. Least of all me." The black mist around the wolf began to waver, its form flickering like a shadow caught in a gust of wind. "Darien," Saren said softly, her voice trembling just slightly. "Come back." For a long moment, nothing happened. The wolf stared at her, its red eyes narrowing, its body tense. Then, slowly, it stepped back. The mist began to dissolve, the red glow fading from its eyes. When the transformation reversed, it was abrupt, leaving Darien on his knees, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. Saren moved toward him, ignoring the ache in her own body as she knelt beside him. "Darien," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at her, his gray eyes filled with anguish. You didn't," she said, cutting him off. "That's what matters." Behind them, Galen groaned, his hand pressed to his bloodied chest as he tried to crawl away. Darien's gaze snapped to him, his expression hardening. "Don't," Suzanne said, placing a hand on his arm. Darian hesitated, his jaw tightening. Then he nodded, rising to his feet. "Get out," he said, his voice cold and steady. Galen didn't need to be told twice. He stumbled to his feet, disappearing into the shadows without another word. As the forest grew quiet again, Suzanne turned to Darian, her expression unreadable. "You're not alone in this," she said softly. Darian met her gaze, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time in a long time, he believed her. The clearing was quiet now, the kind of quiet that felt wrong. The blood moon loomed overhead, its crimson glow bleeding into the edges of the forest. Everything, trees, stones, the very air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Darian stood in the center of it all, his shoulders squared, his hands curled into fists at his sides. He was battered and bloodied, but he wasn't broken. Not yet. His eyes, stormy and sharp, were locked on Suzanne, who stood by the altar, her defiance flickering like a flame in the wind. "It doesn't have to be you," he said, his voice low but steady. "It does," Suzanne replied, her tone softer but no less firm. "You know it does." "No," he growled, taking a step closer. "We'll find another way." "There's always another way." She shook her head, her dark hair catching the bloodlight. "Not this time." The moonstone on the altar pulsed with light, its glow deepening with each beat of the ritual. The air shimmered, thick with energy that seemed to press against their skin, their lungs, their hearts. "I won't let you do this," Darian said, his voice breaking. "I won't let you. You don't get to make that choice." Suzanne cut in, her green eyes flashing. "This is my decision, Darian, my life." "And what about mine?" he snapped. "What about the pack? What about everything we've fought for? You think I can just stand here and let you throw yourself away?" Her gaze softened, but her resolve didn't waver. "It's not throwing myself away. It's saving you. All of you." The moonstone flared brighter, the light spilling across the clearing like fire. Suzanne stepped toward it, her movements slow but deliberate, her fingers brushing against the ancient surface. The energy surged, wrapping around her like a mantle, pulling her closer. Darian moved without thinking, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not rough. "Don't do this," he said, his voice raw. "Please." She looked up at him, and for a moment he saw the cracks in her armor, the fear, the doubt, the pain she was carrying alone. "I have to," she whispered. "No," Darian said, shaking his head. "You don't." He stepped in front of her, his broad frame blocking her from the altar. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, his heart pounding against his ribs. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady now. Suzanne's eyes widened. "Darian, I'll give it up," he said, cutting her off. "My alpha powers, my connection to the pack, all of it. Take me instead." The clearing seemed to shudder, the energy around them shifting. The moonstone pulsed again, brighter this time, as though it had heard his words. "You don't have to do this," Suzanne said, her voice trembling. "Yes, I do," he said, his gray eyes meeting hers. "Because I can't lose you. Not like this. Not ever." The air grew heavier, the light from the moonstone blinding now. Suzanne reached for him, her hands trembling, but he stepped back, his gaze steady. He turned to the altar, his hands resting on its surface, the energy wrapping around him like a shroud. "Moon Queen," he said, his voice strong despite the tremor in his chest. "I offer myself, my power, my life. Take it all if it means breaking this curse." The energy surged again, the light engulfing him, pulling him into its depths. "No," Suzanne cried, lunging forward, but the force of the ritual held her back. As the light reached its peak, a figure began to take shape, ethereal and luminous, her silver hair flowing like water. Solara. She stepped from the light, her presence both soothing and commanding. Her glowing eyes swept over the scene, landing on Darian first, then Suzanne. "You have proven yourselves," she said, her voice echoing like the wind through the trees. Darian staggered back, the energy leaving him, but he stayed on his feet, his gaze locked on Solara. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Solara nodded. The curse is broken. Your love has shattered the cycle of pain. She turned to Saren, her expression softening. You were willing to give everything, not for power, but for love. And he, in turn, gave himself to protect you. Such acts are rare, and they are powerful. Saren's chest tightened, her throat dry. What happens now? You live, Solara said simply. Live and lead. Together. The light around her began to fade, her form dissolving into the air. But before she disappeared entirely, she looked back at them, a faint smile on her lips. Be at peace, she said, for you have brought peace to me. The clearing was silent again, the light of the blood moon softening to a pale glow. Saren and Darien stood there, the weight of everything settling over them like a heavy blanket. You didn't have to do that, Saren said finally, her voice breaking. Yes, I did, Darien said, stepping closer, his hand brushing against hers. Because I love you. She looked up at him, her green eyes filling with tears. I love you too. And as the blood moon faded from the sky, the two of them stood together, unbroken, their bond stronger than the curse that had tried to destroy them. Chapter 8. The forest was quiet now, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm. Bodies lay scattered across the battlefield, some breathing, others not. The metallic tang of blood hung in the air, mixing with the faint scent of scorched earth. Smoke curled lazily from the remnants of shattered torches, the flames snuffed out in the chaos. Darien stood at the center of it all, his shoulders slumped, his chest heaving. His blade hung limp in his hand, slick with blood. The weight of everything, the battle, the curse, the sacrifice pressed down on him like an anchor. The wolves of the Silverclaw pack moved around him, their movements slow and deliberate as they tended to the wounded and collected their dead. There was no celebration, no cries of victory. Just a grim, exhausted silence. For the first time in his life, Darien felt small. The strength that had always been there, humming beneath his skin like a second heartbeat, was gone. The connection to his pack, the bond that had defined him as their alpha, was a hollow echo now, distant and faint. He had given it up willingly. For them. For her. But the loss was still sharp. Darien. The voice pulled him from his thoughts, and he turned to see Ronan approaching, his face grim but his eyes steady. It's over, Ronan said, his tone soft. The rival pack has retreated. What's left of them, anyway? Darien nodded, his grip tightening on the hilt of his blade. And Galen? Gone, Ronan said. Fled into the woods like the coward he is. Darien's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to let it go. Galen was no longer his concern. What about the pack? He asked, his voice low. They're shaken, but they'll recover, Ronan said. He hesitated, then added. They saw what you did, Darien. They know what you gave up. Darien's gaze dropped to the ground, his chest tightening. And do they think it was enough? Ronan's expression softened. They don't just follow you, Darien. They believe in you. That's worth more than power. Darien didn't answer. He couldn't. The words felt too heavy, too raw. Instead, he turned away, his eyes scanning the clearing until they landed on the figure lying near the altar. Saren. She was still, too still, her dark hair fanned out around her pale face. For a moment, his heart stopped, the weight in his chest threatening to crush him. But then he saw the faint rise and fall of her chest, the subtle movement of her fingers. She was alive. Darien crossed the distance between them in a few long strides, dropping to his knees beside her. Saren, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes fluttered open, green and bright, and for a moment, she just stared at him, confusion flickering across her face. What happened? She asked, her voice hoarse. You're alive, he said, his voice breaking. Her brow furrowed as she tried to sit up, wincing at the effort. I thought. So did I, he said, his hand brushing against hers. But you're here, you're okay. She looked at him, her gaze searching. The Moon Queen. Darien nodded, his throat tight. She spared you. I think she was impressed. Impressed? Saren echoed, her tone disbelieving. By you, he said, his voice soft. by what you were willing to do. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The clearing around them faded into the background, the sounds of the pack distant and muted. You gave up your powers, Saren said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. It was the only way. You didn't have to, she said, her voice cracking. You didn't. Yes, I did, he said, cutting her off. Because you're worth it. Because we're worth it. Tears welled in her eyes and she didn't try to hide them. You're an idiot, she said, her voice trembling. Probably, he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she laughed. The blood moon was gone now, its red glow replaced by the soft silver light of dawn. The forest was still, the weight of the night slowly lifting as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. Darian helped Saren to her feet, his arms steadying her as they made their way back to the pack. The wolves watched them, their eyes filled with a mix of awe and respect. Darian felt their gazes, felt the unspoken weight of their loyalty, and for the first time since the ritual, he allowed himself to believe that maybe Ronan was right. Maybe power wasn't everything. Maybe belief, true, unwavering belief, was enough. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Saren glanced up at him, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. So what now? She asked. He looked down at her, his gray eyes steady. Now we rebuild. Together. And as they stepped into the light, the future didn't seem quite so heavy anymore. The moon was high when she came. Darian and Saren were standing at the edge of the clearing, the remnants of the night still clinging to the air. The pack was quiet now, their wounds tended, their strength slowly returning. The first hints of dawn peeked over the horizon, but the moonlight still dominated, bathing the forest in an otherworldly glow. And then the air shifted. It wasn't something they saw or heard, more like something they felt. A weight, a presence, pressing against their senses like a hand on their shoulder. Darian turned first, his hand instinctively moving to where his blade used to hang. Saren followed, her breath catching in her chest as the light around them seemed to gather, pooling in the center of the clearing. And from that light she emerged, the Moon Queen. She wasn't like the visions they'd seen before, faint and flickering, like an echo of something long gone. This was different. She was solid, real, her silver hair flowing like water, her eyes glowing with a soft, steady light. She carried herself with a grace that bordered on otherworldly, her presence commanding without being oppressive. Darian Silverclaw, she said, her voice like the rustle of leaves in the wind. Saren Moonshade. Neither of them spoke. They couldn't. You have done what no others before you could, the Moon Queen continued, her gaze sweeping over them. You have broken the curse, shattered the cycle of pain and betrayal. Her eyes softened, a faint smile tugging at her lips, and now you stand at a crossroads. What do you mean? Saren asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The Moon Queen stepped closer, her presence as much felt as seen. The curse has been lifted, but its shadow lingers. You have a choice to make. She raised her hand, and the light around her shifted, forming two paths in the air, one glowing bright and steady, the other darker, flickering like a flame on the verge of extinguishing. Choose the first, the Moon Queen said, her voice soft but firm, and you will live as mortals. The bond between you will remain, but your wolf powers will fade. You will lead quiet lives, free from the burdens of your pack. She gestured to the second path. Choose the second, and you will remain as Alpha and Luna, with all the strength and responsibility that entails. But your bond will be tested. Trials will come, and the choices you make will carry great weight for yourselves and for those who follow you. The clearing was silent, the weight of her words settling over them like a heavy blanket. Darian glanced at Saren, his gray eyes searching hers. What do you think? He asked, his voice low. She hesitated, her gaze flicking between the paths. I think we've fought too hard to walk away now, she said finally. Darian nodded, his jaw tightening. I was hoping you'd say that. The Moon Queen watched them, her expression unreadable. Your decision must be made as one, she said. Your fates are entwined, and your choice must reflect that bond. Darien stepped forward, his shoulders squared, his gaze steady. We choose to stay, he said. Saren moved to his side, her hand brushing against his. Together, she added. The Moon Queen's eyes brightened, her smile softening. So be it, she said. The light around her flared, brighter than before, wrapping around them like a warm embrace. Darien felt it seep into his skin, into his bones, filling the void where his power had once been. Saren gasped beside him, her eyes widening as the energy surged through her, rekindling the strength she hadn't realized she'd missed. When the light faded, they were still standing in the clearing, but everything felt sharper. The air was crisper, the ground firmer beneath their feet. They weren't just wolves anymore. They were more. The Moon Queen stepped back, her form beginning to fade. You have chosen well, she said, her voice growing softer. But remember, your path will not be easy. The strength of your bond will be tested. Hold fast to one another, and you will endure. She paused, her glowing eyes locking onto theirs. Lead with wisdom, with strength, and with love. For that is the true legacy of the Silverclaw Pack. And with that, she was gone, her light dissolving into the night. The clearing was quiet again, the moonlight soft and steady. Darien turned to Saren, his gaze steady. Well, he said, his voice lighter than she expected. No pressure, right? She laughed, a sound that felt like the first real breath she'd taken in days. None at all, she said, smirking. For a moment they stood there, the weight of the night finally lifting. And as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, Saren took his hand, her grip firm, her gaze steady. Together? She said again. Always, he replied. And with that, they turned toward the future stronger, united, and ready for whatever trials lay ahead. Would you like more detail about the Moon Queen? The Silverclaw territory had changed. The scars from the battle were still there if you knew where to look, the jagged tear of a claw mark on a tree trunk, the faint scorch marks on the stone near the Grand Hall, but the pack itself had moved on. The air felt lighter now, the tension that had hung over them for so long finally gone. Under the full moon's glow, the pack thrived. Wolves patrolled the outskirts of the territory with a renewed sense of purpose, while others gathered around the central clearing, their laughter and conversation filling the air. The bond that tied them together was stronger than ever, forged in fire and tempered by loss. And at the heart of it all stood Darien and Saren. They were at the edge of the clearing, just far enough from the noise to feel the quiet but close enough to see the life they'd built. Darien leaned against a tree, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his gray eyes scanning the scene before him. It's strange, isn't it? He said, his voice low. Saren turned to him, her green eyes glinting in the moonlight. What is? Peace, he said, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Feels like we've been chasing it for so long. I'm not sure what to do with it now that it's here. Saren smiled, stepping closer until her shoulder brushed against his. You could start by enjoying it, she said. Easier said than done, he replied, though his tone was lighter now. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the forest pine and earth and something uniquely Silverclaw. Darien inhaled deeply, letting it fill his lungs, letting it remind him of everything they'd fought for. He glanced at Saren, his smirk softening into something warmer. You've changed them, you know. She raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. Me? He nodded. The pack. Me. All of it. You've changed everything. Saren tilted her head, studying him for a moment. I didn't do it alone, she said softly. No, he said, his gaze steady. You didn't. But you're the reason it worked. They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. The moonlight painted the world in shades of silver and shadow, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Darien felt whole. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers before curling around them. Her grip was firm, steady, grounding in a way that he hadn't known he needed. We've come a long way, Saren said after a while, her voice barely above a whisper. Darien nodded, his gaze drifting to the pack gathered in the clearing. Yeah, he said. We have. They stood there for a long time, watching the pack, the forest, the moon above. The peace they'd fought for was fragile, but it was real, and they would protect it with everything they had. Finally, Saren turned to him, her green eyes shining. "The curse is broken," she said, her voice soft but steady. Darian met her gaze, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah," he said. "It is." She stepped closer, her free hand brushing against his chest, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But our story is just beginning, and, as the moonlight wrapped around them, Darian leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, his voice quiet but sure. "Together," he said. "Always," she replied, and for the first time in their long, winding journey, the future felt like a promise.